Beneath the crown lies a graveyard of secrets. From vanished princes to whispering ghosts, England's royal past is not just gilded, it's haunted. These are not bedtime tales, but cold corridors of power, betrayal, and unanswered questions. The kind that slip past coronations and coroners alike. 30 mysteries, centuries unsolved, all bound by blood, throne, and silence. You won't find these in your schoolbooks, but once you hear them, you won't forget. Welcome to 30 Most Unsolved English Royal Mysteries. And remember, history doesn't lie, but it does hide things. Before we descend into the dark halls of royal intrigue, take a second to subscribe. This channel dives deep into the shadows, where history forgets to look. And while you're here, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Singapore? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who else is wandering the timeline with us tonight. The Princes in the Tower vanish, 1483. It should have been a coronation. Instead, it became an erasure. In the summer of 1483, 2-year-old Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard, Duke of York, were escorted to the Tower of London, a tradition at the time, a royal formality before Edward's ascent to the throne. The Tower, despite its grim reputation today, was not yet a tomb in popular imagination. Back then, it was part palace, part fortress, part ceremonial launchpad. So when the young Edward entered its gates in May, the kingdom held its breath not in fear, but in anticipation. That breath would be held forever. The official story, or at least the first draft of one, was that the two boys were being protected. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, brother to the late King Edward IV, was named Lord Protector until Edward's coronation, a temporary title, a short-term chaperone role. Nothing more. And yet within weeks, Parliament declared Edward illegitimate, citing a supposed pre-contract of marriage involving his father. Richard, Protector no more, became King Richard III. And the princes? They were last seen playing in the Tower courtyard that summer. And then, nothing. No royal departure, no procession, no state funeral, no exile. No records, just a slow fade. Two royal boys, one a crowned king, the other a spare, vanished into the stone walls of the tower like breath into cold air. And the kingdom noticed. Rumours didn't just spread, they howled. Whispers of murder crept through the corridors of court, London and beyond. Some pointed the finger directly at Richard III. Who else would benefit from their silence? Who else had the access, the motive, the crown? But motive and guilt are uneasy twins in royal history. Others looked elsewhere. Maybe the Duke of Buckingham, Richard's ally turned rival, had staged a quiet coup. Or perhaps Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor, moved the pieces, clearing a path for her son to eventually seize the throne. Or maybe, just maybe, the boys didn't die at all. Maybe they were hidden, spirited away, disguised as servants, or cloistered as monks in some god-forsaken priory. One claimant would arise decades later. Of course, Perkin Warbeck, a man who said he was the younger prince, Richard. But more on him later. The problem is not the list of suspects. It's the lack of a crime scene. No bodies, no witnesses, no confessions. Just absence, just silence. It wasn't until 1674, nearly 200 years later, that workmen demolishing a stairwell in the White Tower uncovered a wooden box. Inside, two small skeletons. Shoved into a chest, buried under rubble, treated less like royalty and more like evidence inconveniently real. Charles II, unbothered by the scientific method, ordered them interred in Westminster Abbey as the lost princes. A nice gesture, a political solution, a royal shrug. But centuries of dust do not create clarity. They only distort it. And the question of the princes, where they went, how they died, who, if anyone made them disappear, remains unanswerable. Which, of course, only sharpens its grip on the public mind. Was Richard III a child killer or a misunderstood statesman? Did someone else remove the boys to frame him? Did the tower itself, part myth, part memory, swallow them whole in its thirst for blood and legend? Maybe they died quickly. Or maybe they lingered for months, slowly starved in the shadows, forgotten by history before they even had a chance to make it. Or maybe they never died at all. It's the absence that speaks loudest. The silence in the records. The blank space in royal portraits. The fact that nobody could or would look too closely while the crown shifted hands. And that's the thing with royal mysteries. The crime often isn't the murder, it's the forgetting. But forgetting has a strange echo, because nearly 200 years after the boys disappeared, their supposed bones were found, bones tucked beneath a staircase like a guilty thought. And bones, unlike rumours, don't vanish on their own. So let's go there. Because if the princes disappeared in 1483, what did workmen dig up in 1674? The Tower bones, found 1674. It was just another renovation. In 1674, under the reign of Charles II, a king more interested in theatre and mistresses than architecture workers were tasked with dismantling an old staircase in the White Tower. No one expected history to bite back. But as bricks crumbled and timber gave way, a small wooden chest emerged from the debris, nestled beneath a stone landing. It wasn't marked, wasn't guarded, wasn't catalogued in any royal ledger. It was just there. Inside, two skeletons, small, child-sized, cramped together in silence, as if even in death they weren't allowed the dignity of space. The workmen did what any 17th century builders would do. They told someone important, and for reasons part political, part theatrical, Charles II took a keen interest. The remains were declared with what feels like suspicious haste to be those of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, the vanished princes in the Tower. Now, it's worth pausing to appreciate the convenience. Two royal heirs disappear under the reign of their ambitious uncle. Their mystery haunts every Tudor monarch that follows. And suddenly, in the middle of a relatively peaceful restoration, their bones resurface just in time to add weight to a narrative that paints Richard III as a villain, legitimizes the Tudor claim retroactively, and gives a little historical seasoning to Charles II's own lineage. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the past has an odd sense of timing. The remains were transferred to Westminster Abbey and buried in an urn marked with royal insignia. A public ceremony. A royal seal. A neat ending. Except it wasn't. Because no one examined the bones. Not properly. Not scientifically. The 17th century lacked even the most basic forensic tools. There was no carbon dating, no DNA analysis, no pathology. Not even a consistent age estimate, just a quick glance and a crown-shaped assumption. And for nearly 300 years, that was enough. Then, in 1933, curiosity sharpened into inquiry. The urn was quietly opened. A team of anatomists examined the bones with the best tools available. At the time, tools still primitive by today's standards, but more precise than those of Charles II's day. Their conclusions were murky. The bones were indeed of children, likely male, roughly the right ages, but they were incomplete. Fragments, some bones missing, animal remains mixed in. And while the skulls showed damage, it was unclear whether it was inflicted before or after death. Most tellingly, they found 2 jawbones indicating that at least one of the skeletons was not a child, or perhaps not even human. The burial site, if we can call it that, was a mess. A box of broken signals, a collection of maybe princes or maybe something else's, hastily buried and later reburied with royal certainty. To this day, the Church of England has denied all modern requests to re-examine the bones using modern technology. DNA tests could help determine if the remains match those of known Plantagenet descendants. Carbon dating could more precisely pinpoint their time of death, but no dice. The official reason? Respect for the dead. The unofficial one? Possibly a fear of what we might find or not find. Because here's the thorn. If these bones aren't the princes, then where are they? Still hidden in the tower's walls? Buried in some unknown corner of London? Or perhaps they never died at all, and the tower's 1,674 find is just a coincidence that came a little too gift-wrapped. The politics of royal archaeology are tricky. Every bone holds implications. Every discovery rewrites power. And when the crown is built on centuries of carefully managed myth, digging up graves starts to feel like tampering with state secrets. Still, the tower bones remain tucked beneath a marble slab in Westminster, buried not just under stone, but under centuries of questions. No one knows for sure who they are. No one knows for sure how they died, and yet the case is treated, in many circles, as closed, as if uncertainty is a form of closure. But uncertainty doesn't bury itself, it lingers. Which brings us to another royal ghost, older, sadder, and possibly just as betrayed. A king who, like the princes, died behind tower walls in shadowed silence. A monarch who ended his life not with a crown, but with a prayer no one witnessed. Because before the tower became a prison for boys, it was already a tomb for kings. And in 1471, during the Wars of the Roses, a fragile, unworldly king was taken into its walls and never came out. Henry VI's last prayer. He wasn't built for it. Kingship, that is. Henry VI was gentle in an age of wolves. He preferred books to battles, contemplation to command. A devout man, soft-spoken and shy, he inherited the English crown as a baby and grew into it like someone forced to wear armour 2 sizes too large. He wasn't so much a ruler as a symbol wheeled about by dukes, manipulated by lords, and overshadowed by his more brutal contemporaries. His reign was not marked by conquest, but collapse. And collapse, in Henry's world, came with a long, echoing thud. The Wars of the Roses were well underway by the time Henry reached adulthood, and they would define his legacy far more than anything he ever did or said. Lancaster versus York. Cousins waging dynastic civil war. Battles with poetic names: Towton, Tewkesbury, Barnet. At the heart of the storm stood Henry, unmoored and often catatonic, while his forceful wife, Margaret of Anjou, did most of the manoeuvring. But Margaret couldn't hold the tide. By 1471, the Yorkist cause led by Edward IV had all but crushed the Lancastrians. Henry's only son, Edward of Westminster, was killed in battle that spring. His queen fled to France, and Henry? He was dragged back to the Tower of London, this time not as a deposed king or an honoured prisoner, but as a broken relic of a vanished line. And then, on the night of May 21st, he died. The official story reads like a shrug. Died of melancholy. That elegant euphemism of the era, thrown at anything inconvenient or unexplained. But few believed it, even at the time. Rumours bloomed immediately. That he had been murdered. That he had been put to silence. That Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, had arrived at the Tower that night, and when he left, the former king was dead. The timing was precise. Edward IV had only just reclaimed the throne. Henry's son was already gone. Why keep the old king alive? Why leave a symbol for the Lancastrian loyalists to rally behind? Why risk rebellion when a quiet death could end a war? But there's no confession, no record, no trial. Just a corpse and a whisper. Later, chroniclers, some writing with Tudor agendas, added dramatic flair. They claimed he was found dead with blood streaming from his skull, that he had been praying when struck, that the floor of Wakefield Tower was soaked red by morning. But these are stories, not sources, and even those who recorded them were unsure what to believe. What we know is this: Henry VI died in the Tower of London, in the same fortress that would later claim the princes. He was 49 years old, spiritually exhausted, and politically obsolete. A ghost of a monarch in life and a question mark in death. Edward IV gave him a modest burial at Chertsey Abbey, as far from London's heart as his legacy could be pushed. But in a strange twist of royal memory, Henry's reputation began to change after his death. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Pilgrims came. A cult grew. Within decades, he was being whispered about as a martyr, even a saint. Henry VII, keen to unite the feuding houses, had his body exhumed and reburied at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. He turned Henry VI into a symbol of reconciliation, of divine endurance, of royal suffering, but not of clarity, because no one ever proved how Henry died. There was no inquest, no document from the Tower Guards, just political convenience and historical fog. Some modern historians believe he truly could have died of despair, that the shock of losing his son, his crown, and his cause might have overwhelmed a man already prone to long catatonic episodes. Others argue that the coincidences are too tight, that Richard of Gloucester, known for efficiency, likely ended the matter in a single, silent act. Still others suggest Edward IV himself may have ordered it, perhaps not cruelly, but pragmatically, as a way to close a bloody chapter with one final, quiet sentence. Whatever happened, no monarch in English history faded so completely, so meekly, and yet, strangely, no monarch has been so stubborn in spirit. His ghost, many claim, still walks Windsor Castle, not howling or vengeful, just walking, pacing, as if still unsure what happened that night in the Tower. But if Henry's end remains an open wound, his death marked a turning point, the moment when murder, or the rumour of it, became a viable political tool. Kings no longer just died, they vanished, conveniently. Their ends smoothed over with polite silence. It wouldn't be the last time England saw a royal corpse without a clear cause, because just a few decades later, another king would die suddenly, unexpectedly, not on the battlefield, not at the hands of a rebel army, but deep in the woods, pierced by a single arrow. And no one ever really believed it was an accident. William II Rufus. A fatal arrow in the New Forest 1100. The trees don't talk, which is precisely why they make such perfect witnesses. It was the 2nd day of August, 1100. The sun had barely crested the edge of the New Forest when King William II, better known as William Rufus, rode out for a hunt. He was, by most accounts, in good spirits, brash, energetic, red-haired to the point of ridicule, and deeply unpopular with monks and moralists. A king known more for his temper and taxation than for saintly behaviour. A man who saw the church as an obstacle, not a guide, and who preferred the company of soldiers to that of bishops. By sundown, he was dead. Shot through the chest with an arrow. The official version is straightforward: a hunting accident. His companion, a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, allegedly loosed an arrow at a stag, missed his mark, and struck the king instead. A tragic mistake. That's what the scribes wrote, in varying degrees of poetic gloom. But like all good royal deaths, this one resists closure. In fact, it doesn't even try. Let's start with the setting. The New Forest was no ordinary woodland. It was a royal forest, designated by William the Conqueror as a private hunting ground. Its creation had displaced entire villages, prompting curses and resentment that lingered long after the trees regrew. By 1100, it already had a reputation for bad luck. William Rufus's own elder brother had died there years earlier in a bizarre fall from a horse. Another relative had also perished under similarly strange circumstances. Local lore whispered that the forest was cursed nature's revenge for Norman brutality. So when William Rufus rode into that canopy of myth and bad memory, he was entering more than a hunting ground. He was stepping into a story already thick with ghosts. The events of the hunt itself are hazy. No full account survives. What we do know is this. By the end of the day, the king was found lying dead in the underbrush with an arrow through his chest. Tyrrell conveniently or suspiciously fled the scene immediately. No attempt to explain, no return to court, no apology, just gone. He escaped to France and lived out his life untouched by prosecution. Now, if that sounds like the behavior of a man guilty of something more than clumsiness, you're not alone. The chronicles differ on details, but many raise their eyebrows. Why would Tyrrell flee if it were an accident? Why were there no other eyewitnesses willing to go on record? Why did William's younger brother, Henry, who had also been in the forest that day, make a beeline straight to Winchester to seize the royal treasury before anyone had even officially confirmed the king's death? Indeed, Henry wasted no time. Within days, some say hours, he had himself crowned King Henry I. It was swift, efficient, almost as if he'd been preparing for the moment. To make it more tangled, Walter Tyrrell later insisted he hadn't even been near the king when the fatal arrow was fired. He blamed someone else, or no one. The record varies depending on who's writing and when. But the takeaway is consistent. Tyrrell denied everything, and no court ever tested his claim. The idea that William Rufus was murdered under the pretense of misfortune has refused to die, and for good reason. The motive is clear. Rufus had no legitimate children and was estranged from both the church and much of the nobility. He was also blocking the ambitions of his younger brother Henry, who wanted the throne and was perfectly positioned to take it. Could Henry have orchestrated the hit? Perhaps. Or perhaps he simply seized the opportunity once the chaos began. Either way, his rapid response suggests foreknowledge, or at the very least, readiness. And what about the arrow? No royal autopsy. No recovered projectile. No forensic trail. Just a story passed down through monkish pens and political mouths. In the centuries since, some have tried to exonerate Tyrrell, painting him as a scapegoat, a name to hang the mystery on. Others suggest the whole hunt was a cover for a planned assassination, perhaps even carried out by one of Henry's agents. Still others return to the superstition of the New Forest itself. Maybe it wasn't conspiracy or coincidence. Maybe it was a cursed land that simply refused to let the conqueror's sons die peacefully. The truth? Nobody knows. There is a stone marker where William Rufus supposedly fell. It's called the Rufus Stone. Tourists visit it now, standing beneath trees that haven't changed much since the 11th century. The air there still feels heavy, like something once screamed and never left. A king died in the woods with no trial, no justice, and no resolution. and another king rose from that silence without ever answering for what came before. But this would not be the last time England wondered whether a royal really died when and where he was supposed to. Because not long after Rufus's fatal hunt, another king would vanish into a very different kind of uncertainty. He didn't fall in a forest. He disappeared behind castle walls with rumours so strange. Some say he faked his own death entirely. Edward II, murdered, or did he escape? 1327. No one expected Edward II to last long on the throne, and yet few expected him to vanish from it quite so spectacularly. Born to Edward I, Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, Edward II was everything his father was not. More interested in music than military campaigns, more attached to court favourites than to governance, more likely to retreat to a riverside estate than stand at the front of an army. A medieval square peg in a crown-shaped hole. He reigned for 2 decades, but the writing was always somewhere on the wall. Between disastrous military defeats, noble uprisings, and his infamous favouritism particularly toward the unpopular Piers Gaveston and later the Despencer family, Edward found himself increasingly isolated. His queen, Isabella of France, eventually joined the opposition. In 1326, she invaded England alongside her ally and alleged lover, Roger Mortimer. Edward fled. He was captured. And in January of 1327, he was forced to abdicate in favour of his son, the future Edward III. At that point, most royal stories would end with a discreet imprisonment and a sudden, tidy death. This one didn't Instead, Edward II was quietly imprisoned at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, and then, according to the official version of events, he died there in September of that year. The cause? Unclear. Some said illness, others suggested something darker, but no specifics were officially confirmed. A funeral was held, a tomb was built at Gloucester Cathedral, but what happened inside the castle walls? That's where the mystery begins. Within a few short years, rumours began to circulate that Edward II had not died at all. In 1330, his son Edward III, now of age, and tired of Mortimer's influence, staged a coup and executed Mortimer for treason. During Mortimer's trial, no direct mention was made of Edward II's death. Odd, considering Mortimer would have been implicated in any royal murder. Suspiciously odd. Then, sometime around 1336, a letter surfaced. Now known as the Fieschi letter, it was sent by an Italian priest named Manuele Fieschi to Edward III. It claimed that Edward II had escaped from Berkeley Castle with the help of a servant, wandered across Europe in disguise, and was now living a quiet, repentant life as a hermit in Italy. A remarkable claim, and not an easy one to dismiss. The letter includes details about Edward II's captivity and escape that would have been difficult for a random Italian cleric to know. It also includes accurate references to events not widely publicized at the time. Some historians believe the letter was a political plant. Others argue it may reflect an actual escape, covered up to preserve public stability. But the plot thickens. In the 1342nd, an English traveller claimed to have met a man near Milan who called himself William the Welshman, a former king in hiding. He told stories of court life only someone on the inside would know. Again, it was dismissed as rumour, but the coincidences stack. More recently, historians examining burial records and diplomatic correspondence from the 1332nd have noted a string of cryptic letters and payments tied to the former king's name. One royal envoy was paid to bring news from the continent to the English court news. Some speculate that could only refer to Edward II. Could he have lived out his days in disguise? It wouldn't be the first time a deposed monarch melted into myth. There were monasteries, castles, outposts. Europe was full of places for a man with a broken crown and a borrowed name to disappear. Of course, there's the body. Edward II has a tomb. It's beautifully carved, still visited, still presented as authentic, but no exhumation has ever been authorized. His remains have never been tested, and the record of his death remains riddled with blank spaces. Modern scholars remain split. Some believe the escape theory is romantic revisionism, a satisfying fiction crafted by supporters who couldn't bear the truth of a murdered king. Others argue the silence speaks volumes, that the lack of documentation around his death, combined with the suspicious timing of Mortimer's downfall, suggests a secret too large to speak aloud. The truth is probably buried somewhere between the politics of the moment and the paranoia of history. Maybe Edward II was killed, quietly, with no theatrics. Maybe he did escape, aided by allies who staged his death as convincingly as any medieval drama. Maybe he became William the Welshman, living out his last years with none of the burdens of the throne. What we're left with is a tomb that may or may not be empty, a letter that may or may not be true, and a ghost of a king who refused to stay put. But Edward wasn't the first English monarch to suffer an ambiguous end. Over 300 years earlier, another king's death had sparked equally bizarre rumours, except this one took place in the unlikeliest of places. A royal privy, Edmund Ironside's bathroom death, 1016. History has a way of making things neat that were never neat to begin with. But in the case of Edmund Ironside, King of the English, for just 7 chaotic months in the year 1016, nothing about his short reign, or especially his death, fits into any clean narrative. Least of all the setting in which it allegedly took place. The year was a bad one for England. The Viking invasions were reaching their crescendo. The Danes, led by the cunning Knut, soon to be known as the Great, were clawing their way across the country. King Ethelred the Unready had just died, leaving the throne to his warrior son, Edmund Ironside, a young man with a reputation for bravery, grit, and, as the nickname suggests, a steel-like will to fight. And fight he did. In a matter of months, Edmund clashed with Knut's forces in at least 5 major battles, winning some, losing others, and dragging England into a violent stalemate. By late 1016, with both sides exhausted, the two men met and brokered a treaty. The country was to be divided. Edmund would rule Wessex, the south and west, while Knut would take the north and east. When either man died, the other would take full control of England. That should have bought Edmund a few years of uneasy peace, but it didn't do. Within weeks, perhaps even days, Edmund was dead. At the age of just 26, the new king of half England died suddenly in Oxford, or possibly Gloucestershire. The sources disagree. The cause? That's where the story veers hard into legend. According to some medieval chroniclers, Edmund died of natural causes, likely wounds sustained in battle or an illness brought on by months of campaign fatigue. But other sources, mainly writing decades later, offer a far more colourful version. They claim that Edmund was murdered while using the royal privy, stabbed from below, they say, through the very seat itself. A brutal, theatrical end for a warrior king. A scene so strange it sounds more like a Shakespearean farce than a Saxon tragedy. The story, while often repeated, is not backed by contemporary accounts. It seems to have emerged during the 12th century, when chroniclers were more interested in moral instruction and narrative drama than precise documentation. Still, the tale stuck, because it's vivid, because it's weird. Because it fits the atmosphere of backroom deals and sudden deaths that defined the period. Whether or not the privy murder happened, the political effect was the same. Edmund was gone, and Canute wasted no time in taking the rest of the kingdom. The treaty succession clause kicked in immediately, and with no sons of Edmund old enough to challenge him, Canute became the undisputed king of all England. He even married Edmund's stepmother, Queen Emma of Normandy, to consolidate his claim further. So, was Edmund assassinated? Possibly. He was the last significant Saxon obstacle to Canute's full rule, and given the Viking king's reputation for strategic ruthlessness, it wouldn't be out of character. Eliminating Edmund quietly, quickly, would have removed any need for further conflict or negotiation. But there's another theory, and it's almost more disturbing in its banality, that Edmund simply died. That the warrior king, exhausted by months of battle, weakened by wounds, or struck by disease, simply succumbed to the weight of his moment. No assassination, no treachery. Just bad luck and worse timing. Of course, for medieval chroniclers and modern minds alike, bad luck doesn't satisfy. We want design, we want plots, we want kings to die as dramatically as they lived. A toilet stabbing is crude, yes, but it's narratively perfect. It reduces the throne to the throne. It drips with the irony that so often coats royal history. And yet, that may be exactly why the story endures, because it plays to a deeper tension in monarchy, that no matter how grand the crown, the body beneath it remains frail, vulnerable, even ridiculous. That the same hand that signs treaties might pull a chain in a moment of privacy, and in doing so, find betrayal waiting underneath. If Edmund was murdered, no culprit was ever named. No investigation was conducted. No memorials were commissioned in suspicion. His body was buried perhaps at Glastonbury, though even that is debated, and the crown passed on. Quietly. Completely. But even now, his death sits awkwardly in the timeline. It interrupts the linear march of conquest with a question mark. Was he a warrior cut down at his peak, or a victim of palace intrigue? Did he die with a sword in his hand, or with his guard completely down? There are no clear answers, only gaps. And in the next of those gaps, another royal enigma waits, not a murdered king, but a vanished treasure. Not a crown lost in war, but a hoard lost in mud. Gold, jewels, and royal regalia, swallowed by a storm and never seen again. King John's lost treasure, 1216. In the waning months of his reign, King John of England lost nearly everything a monarch could lose: his power, his allies, his reputation, his health, and, famously, his treasure. A royal hoard worth a king's ransom, swallowed by the shifting sands and tides of eastern England. Or so the story goes. Let's rewind. By 1216, John, known less romantically as Lackland, was cornered. His war with the barons had dragged into its 5th bloody year. The sealing of Magna Carta the year before had brought no real peace. Civil war still raged. French forces, invited by the rebel barons, had landed on English soil. The Plantagenet crown was tilting precariously. And John, in the words of many chroniclers, was not handling it well. By October, he was on the move. John's campaign trail took him from the east of England to the west and back again. His goal, to regroup, rally support, and keep ahead of the encroaching French-backed armies. He was sick, paranoid, and increasingly desperate. But in true Plantagenet style, he travelled in full royal pomp, dragging along not just his court and servants, but his gold, his silver plate, his sacred relics, and most notably, his crown jewels. That's where the Wash comes in. The Wash is a shallow estuary on the east coast of England, a flat and foggy landscape of salt marshes, shifting channels, and treacherous tidal flats. Even today, it's a place of eerie transience, land and sea trading places by the hour. In 1216, It was a death trap for the unprepared. John had crossed from King's Lynn to Lincolnshire, while his baggage train carrying the royal treasure was ordered to take a more direct route across the Wash. The plan was simple: traverse the causeway at low tide. The reality was anything but. Something went wrong. Very wrong. The tide came in faster than expected, or the carts sank into the mud, or the guides miscalculated the crossing. No account agrees on the specifics, but the outcome is consistent. The treasure disappeared. Carts overturned. Horses drowned. Chests sank. Somewhere out there in the watery nothing, the wealth of a king was swallowed by the sea. John himself wasn't present for the loss. He arrived later, too late to save anything. According to some accounts, the news of the disaster struck him like a mortal blow. His health deteriorated rapidly. Within days, he developed dysentery and died at Newark Castle on the 19th of October, leaving behind a chaotic kingdom and one of the strangest open questions in royal history. Where is the treasure? Because it has never been found. Not a single royal artifact from the Wash has been recovered with certainty. No golden plate, no jewel-encrusted scepters, no pieces of the fabled English crown that John carried. Nothing. In an age where monarchs were buried with trinkets and towns were ransacked for silver spoons, the idea that such a massive load of royal wealth simply vanished seems on the surface implausible. And so the theories multiply. Maybe the treasure was never lost at all, some argue. Maybe it was looted by opportunistic soldiers or conveniently disappeared by those loyal to John's enemies. After all, who would miss what couldn't be counted? Others suggest John staged the whole event an elaborate royal insurance fraud to excuse the absence of funds and distract from political failure. Still others hold to the classic version, that it lies buried somewhere in the silt and sand of the Wash, protected by centuries of tidal secrecy. Metal detectors have swept the area for decades. Amateurs, archaeologists, even treasure hunters with high-tech ground radar have combed the land. Bits of medieval debris surface now and then, horseshoes, broken nails, but nothing that suggests a royal caravan. The allure of the treasure is more than monetary. It's symbolic. It's the moment when a king's physical legacy was quite literally sucked into the earth. It's the perfect metaphor for John's reign. Unstable, unreliable, sinking under its own weight. John himself has long been remembered as one of England's most loathed monarchs, cruel, erratic, treacherous, and weak. But the loss of the treasure gave his reign a mythic punctuation mark. It turned a failed king into a legend, a cautionary tale in gold and mud. And yet the treasure remains a possibility, a temptation, a maybe. Somewhere beneath layers of modern farmland and ancient estuary, beneath wind turbines and grazing sheep, a part of English royal history may still be waiting. Or maybe it was never there to begin with. But the absence, as always, is the point. In the gaps between what was and what is, mystery grows. And sometimes, those gaps aren't in land or tide, but in identity itself. Because just a few decades after John's treasure was swallowed, another royal question emerged. A boy appeared in the court of Europe, claiming to be a lost prince of England. And the strange thing was, he almost convinced them. Perkin Warbeck's true identity, 1492nd. He arrived with a name, but not his own. In the 1492nd, Europe was a chessboard of fragile alliances, grudges, and whispers. The Wars of the Roses had officially ended. Henry VII sat on the English throne, not by inheritance, but by conquest. The Tudors were new, their claim tenuous, their enemies many. And into this fragile peace stepped a young man claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes in the Tower, presumed dead for nearly a decade. His name was Perkin Warbeck, or so the Tudors called him. He was first noticed in Burgundy, where he styled himself as a young noble and quickly gained the attention of Margaret of York's sister to Edward IV, and thus aunt to the missing princes. She embraced him, publicly and politically, claimed to recognize him, called him nephew. Whether she truly believed it or simply saw an opportunity to destabilize the Tudor regime remains unclear. But either way, the die was cast. Warbeck's story was detailed, elaborate, and suspiciously well informed. He claimed that after the supposed murder of his brother Edward V, he himself had been spared secretly smuggled out of the Tower and into exile by a loyal supporter. Raised in hiding, moving from safe house to sanctuary, eventually reaching the continent, where he finally decided to reveal his identity and claim the throne. The courts of Europe were divided. France gave him tentative recognition. Burgundy gave him a banner. The Holy Roman Emperor referred to him as the Duke of York. Scotland went further. King James IV not only recognized his claim, but offered him a noble bride and an army. For Henry VII, this wasn't just a nuisance, it was a threat. A living, breathing embodiment of every Tudor insecurity. If Warbeck truly was Richard of York, then Henry's right to rule was nullified. Even if he wasn't, the mere idea of a surviving prince could stir rebellion in a country not far removed from dynastic bloodshed. So the Tudor response was calculated and relentless. Henry sent spies, he offered bribes, he wrote open letters declaring Warbeck a fraud. A Flemish boatman's son taught court manners by Yorkist exiles. And eventually, after several failed invasions and half-hearted uprisings, Warbeck's support began to crumble. He landed in Cornwall in 1497, hoping to spark rebellion among a population already frustrated by taxation. But the movement fizzled. Warbeck was captured, paraded through London, and after 2 years of confinement in relative comfort executed in 1499. But here's where the mystery deepens. Warbeck's confession, released by the Tudors, declared him a fraud. He admitted to being the son of a customs official from Tournai. He confessed to deception, forgery, ambition. It was a clean conclusion to a messy episode. Except, was it? Many historians have questioned the confession's authenticity. It was written under duress, possibly dictated, and certainly edited by Henry's propagandists. Parts of Warbeck's story, especially his knowledge of Yorkist court life, remained eerily accurate. His bearing was noted as noble, his fluency in multiple languages suggested aristocratic training, and his ability to earn recognition from royal courts across Europe wasn't something a random impostor could typically pull off. Then there's the silence of Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's queen, and sister to the real Richard of Shrewsbury. She never publicly commented on Warbeck, never affirmed or denied his identity. Her husband had every reason to parade her as the ultimate witness against him. But he didn't. Why? Some believe Elizabeth recognized the man and chose silence over betrayal. Others argue she, like everyone else, simply didn't know. The boys in the Tower vanished young. A decade and a half had passed. People change, faces blur. In the absence of certainty, everything becomes performance. Warbeck's legacy is not just one of deception or rebellion, it's one of possibility. He reminds us that a well-timed story, convincingly told, can shake kingdoms. Whether he was Richard of York or not almost ceases to matter. Enough people believed he might be, and in monarchy, belief is often more powerful than truth. Henry VII understood that. His obsession with legitimacy shaped every decision he made. He married Elizabeth of York to unify the warring houses. He ruthlessly eliminated rivals, and he wrote history with the same control he used to govern firm, revisionist, and utterly intolerant of ambiguity. But ambiguity thrives in the shadows, especially when bloodlines are contested, heirs disappear, and crowns rest on the thinnest strands of narrative. Which brings us to another child at the center of a succession crisis, a baby born in a royal bedchamber, amid rumors of imposture and fraud, whose mere existence helped to unmake a king, and whose crib, some whispered, had more to hide than just an heir. The Warming Pan Baby, 1688. Royal births are, by design, public affairs ritualized, scrutinized, and impossible to fake, at least in theory. But on the night of the 10th of June, 1688, something happened in the royal bedchamber that would ignite one of the most persistent, poisonous, and history-altering conspiracy theories in the English monarchy: the arrival of a baby boy to King James II and his queen, Mary of Modena. A moment that should have stabilized the succession. Instead, it blew it to pieces. The birth itself was momentous. For years, James and Mary had failed to produce a surviving male heir. England, increasingly Protestant, had tolerated James's Catholicism, just barely under the belief that his Protestant daughters from his first marriage would eventually inherit the throne. Princess Mary, married to the Protestant William of Orange, was a particularly palatable successor. The system was uneasy, but it was holding. Until the baby arrived. A son, a Catholic son, one who would now take precedence over his older Protestant sisters. Overnight, the political balance shifted. The Protestant nobility panicked. Parliament gritted its teeth. The press turned feral, and within hours of the birth announcement, the whisper began. The baby wasn't real. Not a baby, mind you. A baby had definitely been presented, but was it Mary's? That was the question. Or had a stillborn or non-existent child been quietly replaced with someone else's infant smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber in a warming pan, the kind used to heat beds in chilly palaces? It sounds absurd, and yet the story took off like wildfire. Within days, pamphlets were circulating across London. Court gossips whispered of Spanish infants brought in through back corridors. Witnesses swore they saw a strange woman holding a bundled child near the royal apartments. Servants claimed to have heard conflicting cries, one baby wailing, another silent. The warming pan theory took shape with every telling. A fake pregnancy, a secret miscarriage, and then a Catholic changeling slid in beneath the covers to deceive the realm. James II was livid. He ordered a formal inquiry. Over 40 people, doctors, midwives, noblewomen, courtiers testified to the birth's legitimacy. They insisted the Queen had gone through a full and visible pregnancy. They described the delivery in detail, and yet the skepticism only deepened. The more James insisted, the less people believed him. Why? Because James was already unpopular. His open Catholicism, his autocratic leanings, his preference for placing Catholics in high office, all of it had stirred resentment. The birth of a male heir didn't feel like destiny. It felt like a provocation. The idea of being ruled by a Catholic dynasty was intolerable to much of the Protestant elite. And so, the conspiracy became not just palatable but useful. The story reached Princess Mary and William of Orange, exiled in the Dutch Republic. They seized on it, publicly questioning the child's legitimacy. By November, William landed in England with an army. James II, abandoned by much of his court, fled the country. Parliament declared that he had abdicated by fleeing, and offered the throne jointly to William and Mary. The child, the supposed heir, was quietly escorted into exile with his mother. His name? James Francis Edward Stuart, known later, perhaps appropriately, as the Old Pretender. The warming pan theory should have died in exile, but it didn't. It festered. For decades, the Jacobite cause supporters of the exiled Stuart line insisted the boy was real, legitimate, and wrongfully disinherited. Meanwhile, the Whigs and much of Protestant England clung to the belief that the child had been a fraud, an imported Catholic lie used to cement a dynasty no one wanted. Even today, historians remain divided. Most modern scholars agree the baby was indeed Mary's. The pregnancy had been too public to fake, the delivery too well documented. But the fact that so many believed otherwise speaks volumes about the fragility of royal trust. When a monarch becomes suspect, even the most basic truths like the arrival of an heir can unravel into scandal. The warming pan baby is not just a mystery of maternity. It's a mirror held up to political paranoia, religious fear, and the weaponization of doubt. It shows how thin the line is between succession and usurpation, and how easily faith in a crown can be burned away by the heat of a rumour. And it wasn't the last time England faced a question of hidden heirs and secret marriages. Because long before James II tried to secure a Catholic legacy, another royal man, this time a merry king, with too many mistresses, was rumoured to have hidden away the one piece of evidence that could have rewritten the royal line forever inside a locked black box. Lucy Walter's black box. The English monarchy has never lacked for rumours. But some whispers last longer than others because they don't just haunt the throne. They threaten to rewrite its very foundation. Enter Lucy Walter, mistress to a future king, mother to a doomed duke. And if legend is to be believed, the woman who once held the fate of the English crown in a locked container that no one ever saw, the mysterious black box. To understand the weight of this alleged box, you have to understand the man at the centre of it all, Charles II. Charles, the so-called Merry Monarch, restored the monarchy in 1660 after a long, bloody interregnum. The English Civil War had decapitated his father, Charles I. Cromwell had ruled in the interim, and when the Puritan experiment collapsed, Charles returned from exile in a blaze of public revelry, theatrical charm, and an all-but public promise to never again take anything, including kingship, too seriously. But there was a problem. Charles II, while endlessly entertaining and prodigiously fertile, was conspicuously without a legitimate heir. His queen, Catherine of Braganza, bore no children. Yet Charles fathered at least a dozen illegitimate ones acknowledged, titled, "Even adored, but not one of them could wear the crown." English law was clear. Only the offspring of a legitimate, recognized marriage could succeed. And that's where Lucy Walter reappears. A Welsh gentlewoman of modest means and considerable charm. She met Charles during his exile in The Hague in the 1642. The two embarked on an affair that produced a son, James later styled the Duke of Monmouth. For most of Charles's life, that was the official story. Lucy was a mistress, nothing more. But then the rumours began that Charles had secretly married her, that there had been a ceremony quiet, but legal, that the child wasn't just another royal bastard, but the king's rightful firstborn son, and that Lucy had possessed the proof, a marriage contract, signed and witnessed, hidden away in a small container known only as the black box. A simple wooden chest, or a jewelled case, or a leather pouch. The accounts vary, but always black, always secret, and always missing. The idea gained traction after Charles's death in 1685, when his openly Catholic brother James II inherited the throne. James was deeply unpopular. The political elite, hungry for a Protestant alternative, latched on to Monmouth, handsome, Protestant, and charismatic. If Monmouth could be proven legitimate, he'd be the rightful king. And so, attention turned toward Lucy Walter's box. The problem? No one could find it. Monmouth himself claimed not to know its whereabouts. Some of his supporters swore the documents had existed, had seen them, even. Others dismissed it as pure fiction. Charles II, when pressed during his lifetime, had flatly denied any marriage, repeatedly, publicly. "I am a man of truth," he reportedly told his council, "and I was never married to Lucy Walter." But how much weight does a king's denial hold, especially one as slippery with facts as Charles? The story refused to die. Parliament even conducted an inquiry into the Black Box claim during James II's reign. It went nowhere. No evidence emerged. No witness could be pinned down. And with Monmouth's failed rebellion in 1685 and his subsequent execution, the urgency to prove anything evaporated. Still, the myth lingered, partly because Monmouth looked like a king. He had the bearing, the popularity, the gallant tilt of someone born to rule, and partly because the political moment demanded it. Protestant England, watching the rise of a Catholic dynasty, wanted a different ending. The Black Box gave them a tantalizing what if. But mostly, the mystery endured because of what it implies, that royal legitimacy might not be a matter of public record, but of secret boxes and vanished letters. That the throne could be altered by a single hidden document, or its absence. Modern historians generally dismiss the Black Box story as a convenient invention. There's no reliable evidence that Charles married Lucy. No trace of such a contract has surfaced. And Charles's lifelong refusal to legitimize Monmouth, despite clearly loving him, suggests that the marriage never happened. And yet, it's not the box itself that matters anymore. It's the idea of it. A locked container, somewhere, that holds the truth about the crown quietly, invisibly, waiting. It's the kind of object that history loves and truth fears. Something that could have changed everything, but now changes nothing because it's lost or never existed. The monarchy is built on such absences, on silences, on questions no one can definitively answer and documents no one can conclusively find. And sometimes, what lingers isn't a box, but a barrel. Because another royal figure from the same brutal era left behind a riddle soaked in myth. A man said to have been executed, not by sword or rope, but by wine. Death by wine. George, Duke of Clarence, 1478. There are many ways to kill a man, but drowning him in wine, that takes a special kind of poetry. Or perhaps, more precisely, it takes a royal rumour, one that has persisted for over 5 centuries, staining England's Plantagenet history with equal parts irony and intrigue. The man in question, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother to King Edward IV, and, depending on whom you ask, a traitor, a martyr, a pawn, or a drunk who got the most fitting end history could conjure. Let's start with George himself. He was born in 1449, the third surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. His older brother was Edward, the man who would seize the throne during the Wars of the Roses and become Edward IV. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would one day become Richard III. George stood, quite literally, in the middle of a bloody royal tug-of-war. Initially, he supported Edward's claim, fought for it, stood beside him as he won the crown, but George was not built for loyalty. He was ambitious, impulsive, and critically in love with his own reflection in the royal mirror. The moment it suited him, he turned. In 1469, George married Isabel Neville, daughter of Richard Neville, the notorious kingmaker, Earl of Warwick. Together, they tried to unseat Edward IV and install George himself as king. It failed. Badly. George fled to France, reconciled, betrayed again, and was forgiven again. His political life became a pendulum always swinging, never steady. By the mid-1472, the facade of family unity had worn thin. Isabel died suddenly in 1476, possibly from complications after childbirth. George was convinced she had been poisoned by one of her ladies-in-waiting. He had the woman arrested and executed without royal permission. That, in retrospect, was unwise. The following year, tensions between George and Edward exploded. Accusations were thrown. Treason was whispered. Secret dealings were alleged. Whether George was actively plotting against his brother again or merely perceived as a threat remains uncertain. But in February 1478, he was tried for treason in a private session of Parliament. The result was inevitable. He was found guilty. The king hesitated. This was his brother after all. Blood. But political necessity outweighed fraternal sentiment, and Edward signed the death warrant. And here, precisely here, is where fact slides off the edge of the record. The official chronicles note only that George was executed in the Tower. No cause listed, no method recorded. A strange omission, given the weight of the moment. Executing a royal duke, especially a royal brother, wasn't routine, yet the record is oddly mute. Then the stories begin. That George was not hanged, nor beheaded, nor otherwise disposed of with the typical severity of high treason. Instead, he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, a sweet, fortified drink imported from the Mediterranean. A bizarre, almost theatrical method of execution, and one that, if true, would be uniquely tailored to George's personality and reputation. He was known, after all, for his love of drink, and Malmsey, in particular, was a court favourite. Killing him in a vat of it almost feels like gallows humour dark irony as statecraft. Or perhaps a subtle act of mercy from a conflicted brother, a death that was technically execution but softened with absurdity. But was it true? Contemporary sources are divided. Some later chroniclers, especially Tudor writers, repeat the wine story as fact. Others make no mention of it. There's no surviving Tower record confirming the method. No eyewitness account. It exists in that strange royal grey zone. Plausible, repeated, but never quite proven. And so, it endures. George's body was buried at Tewkesbury Abbey beside Isabel. No wine stains reported. But the legend became part of English folklore, referenced by Shakespeare in Richard III, where Clarence dreams of drowning in a cask. That image, claustrophobic, rich, oddly grotesque, has defined him ever since. Modern historians remain skeptical. Some suggest the wine story originated as satire, an exaggerated footnote that took on the sheen of reality over time. Others suspect it might have been real after all. A custom-built punishment designed to humiliate George while sparing Edward the bloodshed of public execution. Either way, it's the version people remember. Because what could be more medieval, more melodramatic, more morbidly poetic than dying in the thing you loved most? George Plantagenet was a man who never knew which side he was on. He flattered, plotted, betrayed, and begged in a dizzying cycle. In the end, he left behind no lasting claim, only a rumour, sealed in oak and soaked in symbolism. But while George's death was obscure, the disappearance that followed some centuries later would be far more blatant. Because one day, In a royal stronghold in Ireland, an entire set of priceless crown jewels, sapphires, rubies, emeralds, and diamonds simply vanished, and not a soul ever saw them again. The Irish Crown Jewels Heist, 1907. If you were planning the perfect royal theft one, so clean, so absurd, and so unsolvable, it would haunt a government for over a century. You'd probably begin with a few key ingredients: an unsecured vault, a compromised official, a cast of aristocratic suspects, a palace with too many keys, and, of course, diamonds. Lots of diamonds. In 1907, someone stole the regalia of the Order of St. Patrick from Dublin Castle, known colloquially as the Irish Crown Jewels. The collection included a heavily jeweled star and badge encrusted with Brazilian diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and sapphires. Meant to dazzle on the chest of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the monarch's representative on the island. The total value was estimated at £30,000 at the time. Adjusted for inflation and historical reverence, that figure now enters the realm of priceless. But what elevates this crime from robbery to legend is not the glitter, it's the silence. Because not only were the jewels never recovered, no one was ever arrested. No trial, no confession. Not even a formal list of suspects released to the public. The theft didn't just vanish the jewels, it erased the narrative. And that's what makes it an enduring mystery. Here's what we know. In preparation for a royal visit by King Edward VII, Dublin Castle was undergoing a superficial shine-up. Among the many logistics was the transfer of the crown jewels from a bank vault to the newly constructed Office of Arms within the castle complex. The man responsible for their safekeeping? Sir Arthur Vickers, the Ulster King of Arms, a jovial, portly man known for his love of drink, ornate waistcoats, and somewhat less than obsessive approach to security. He was given a safe. The safe was placed inside a strong room. That strong room had 7 keys. Vickers had 1. The others, unclear. Various officials, assistants, and aides had copies. The record-keeping was charitably non-existent. And then, sometime between the 11th of June and the 6th of July of 1907, the jewels disappeared. There was no forced entry, no broken locks, no alarms. In fact, there wasn't even an official record of when the jewels had last been seen. Vickers claimed to have discovered the theft days before the official announcement, but he never explained the delay. The government, humiliated, launched an inquiry. Sort of. What followed was one of the most compromised investigations in British history. The viceregal court, anxious to avoid scandal, suppressed details. A parliamentary commission was suggested, then shelved. A report was compiled but never published. Instead, the blame settled conveniently on Vickers himself. Not for stealing the jewels, but for failing to prevent the theft. He was dismissed, publicly shamed, and exiled into ignominy. But was he guilty? That depends on which conspiracy you find most believable. Theory number 1. Inside job. Vickers was either the thief or covered for someone who was. Supporters point to his heavy drinking, erratic behaviour, and refusal to answer direct questions during the internal inquiry. Some suggest he panicked after discovering the theft and tried to cover it up until he could retrieve the jewels. He never did. Theory number 2. Aristocratic scandal. This is the more salacious version. According to some accounts, the Office of Arms had become something of a private gentleman's club. Guards were routinely dismissed at night. Unauthorized visitors were admitted. One rumour insisted the jewels were stolen during a drunken party gone wrong, possibly involving individuals too powerful to prosecute. Names whispered at the time included peers of the realm, royal favourites, even members of the king's inner circle. Theory number 3. Republican theft. Irish nationalists had long loathed the symbolism of the crown jewels being housed in Dublin. Could a faction have stolen them as a symbolic act of rebellion? Maybe. But there's no evidence they were used for propaganda. No group claimed responsibility. No ransom demand was made. The jewels simply vanished, and with them, their political utility. Theory number 4. The jewels were never stolen, just misplaced. Absurd? Perhaps. But with no security logs, no chain of custody, and no photographic evidence, it's not impossible that the jewels were removed for some reason, cleaning, copying, temporary storage, and then lost or stolen from elsewhere entirely. Whatever the truth, the damage was done. Dublin Castle's reputation never recovered. Vickers died in 1921, murdered by the IRA during the Irish War of Independence. He maintained his innocence to the end, blaming his staff and the British government in equal measure. As for the jewels, they remain missing to this day. Their ornate craftsmanship has never turned up at auctions, in museums, or on the black market. No fragments, no fakes, just gone. And yet, if a treasure can vanish from a locked safe in a castle under royal oversight, what else can slip through the cracks of time? Well, how about a king? Because just beneath the floorboards of England's forgotten abbey may lie the bones of a monarch whose final resting place has, quite literally, disappeared. Where is Henry I? It's not every day that a king vanishes from his own grave, especially one with as much legacy and appetite as Henry I of England. Henry was the 4th son of William the Conqueror and never supposed to be king. But like many royal stories in medieval England, fate, opportunism, and a few timely deaths cleared the path for him. He seized the throne in 1100 after the suspicious demise of his brother William II, yes, the one with the fatal arrow in the New Forest, and ruled for 35 years. His reign was marked by shrewd politics, brutal power consolidation, and more than a few controversial succession choices. But perhaps what history remembers most about Henry isn't how he lived or ruled, but how he died. Let's start with the ending. Henry I died in December 1135 while on a hunting trip in Normandy. He had ruled England for more than 3 decades and outlived most of his rivals. According to chroniclers, he consumed an excessive amount of lampreys, a slimy, jawless fish he was warned against eating by his physician. Whether it was food poisoning or something more mundane, he became gravely ill and died shortly afterward. A tragic, if not exactly noble, end, but at least there was a plan. Henry's body was embalmed, his entrails buried at the site of his death, as was the custom, and the rest of him was transported overland and across the Channel back to England to be interred at Reading Abbey, which he had founded years earlier. It was to be a fitting, permanent resting place for a king who helped shape Norman England into something more bureaucratically solid and culturally English. And then, silence. For a while, things seemed straightforward. Chronicles recorded the funeral. The abbey was respected, even revered. Pilgrims came. Royal successors paid tribute. But as the centuries passed, something happened not to the memory of Henry, but to his tomb itself. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 16th century brought widespread destruction to abbeys and religious houses across the country. Reading Abbey, like many others, was seized, looted, and left to ruin. Stones were taken, monks expelled, graves disturbed. The layout of the complex faded beneath urban development. Over time, the abbey's sacred geography was replaced by housing, roads, and even a prison. And with it, Henry's burial place disappeared. Today, the precise location of Henry I's tomb is unknown. That's right. The 4th son of the Conqueror, the king who issued the Charter of Liberties, a distant ancestor of Magna Carta, the ruler of both England and Normandy, has no known grave. Archaeologists believe his remains may still lie somewhere beneath the site of the ruined abbey in Reading. But despite multiple surveys and excavations, some as recent as the 21st century, nothing definitive has been found. Ground-penetrating radar has identified potential burial sites beneath modern roads and nearby schoolyards, but no one has dug them up. And even if they did, what would they find? Centuries of building and erosion have scrambled the site. The stone markers are long gone. Any identifying features, coffins, inscriptions, royal artifacts likely plundered or decayed. It's possible Henry's bones are still there, mingled with others, unmarked and anonymous, beneath a patch of Reading sidewalk. Or perhaps they were destroyed entirely during the abbey's dissolution. Or perhaps, in a moment lost to time, they were quietly reburied elsewhere, out of reverence or secrecy, or both. The loss raises questions that go beyond archaeology. What does it mean for a king to disappear? A ruler with a tombless afterlife? The absence feels oddly fitting for Henry, a king remembered less for showy drama and more for silent, methodical control. A man who codified power but failed, fatally, to secure his dynasty. Because the chaos after Henry's death was staggering. Despite having dozens of illegitimate children, he had only one legitimate male heir who drowned in the White Ship disaster years before. He named his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his successor. But the barons didn't want a queen. Civil war broke out, the anarchy, a brutal, 2-decade struggle that only ended when Matilda's son, Henry II, finally took the throne. A missing tomb doesn't erase a legacy, but it does cast a shadow over it. For a man obsessed with order, who ruled with relentless efficiency, who built abbeys and enforced justice, it's almost cosmically ironic that he is now a historical question mark. That his body lies somewhere no one can confirm. That a king who once commanded England now lies beneath. Reading in pieces, possibly beneath a car park, a school playground, or a public restroom. There's no marker. No candles, no crown, just the knowledge that once a man called Henry ruled a nation and then, like so many things in English royal history, slipped silently out of sight. But some royal ghosts refuse to stay buried, especially those with unfinished screams. Because the next monarch to haunt our list left behind not a missing tomb, but a hallway that still echoes with footsteps. A hallway that trembles with a teenage queen's final unanswered plea. Catherine Howard's haunted gallery. The door was shut. The king was in the chapel, and she ran barefoot, wild-eyed, young. That's how the story goes. Catherine Howard, 5th wife of King Henry VIII, was no more than 17 when she married him. Maybe 16. The records, as always, are vague where it matters most. But everyone agrees she was young, beautiful, and utterly unprepared for what the crown required of her. Henry, by contrast, was in his late 40s, obese, gout-ridden, and increasingly paranoid. He had already executed one wife, annulled 2 others, and was beginning to fancy himself a kind of living judge over fate itself. Catherine represented something he hadn't had in years: youth, innocence, and a promise of legacy. She was the cousin of Anne Boleyn, Henry's former queen and former beheading victim. The symbolism was thick even before the blood started flowing. When they married in 1540, the king was besotted. He called her his rose without a thorn, gave her lavish gifts, praised her in courtly language he hadn't used since his early reign. But Catherine was no rose, at least. Not in the eyes of those who had seen her grow up. Her past was complicated. Before Henry, she'd lived in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household, a place more permissive than pious. There, Catherine had shared rooms, beds, secrets with men. 2 in particular: Henry Manox, a music teacher, and Francis Derham, a former secretary. The nature of her relationships with them, whether they were consensual, coerced, or court gossip, is still debated, but the rumors followed her into the palace like smoke under a door, and eventually, they caught fire. In 1541, while Henry was away, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer placed a letter on the king's pew at Hampton Court. In it were the accusations. Catherine had been promiscuous before her marriage, and worse, may have continued such behaviour during her queenship. At the centre of the scandal was a courtier named Thomas Culpeper, a man Henry had once trusted. He and Catherine had allegedly met in secret. Love letters were produced, servants were questioned, torture was applied, confessions extracted. Catherine, for her part, did not immediately confess. She was a teenager trapped in a machine of state. Every move she made was interpreted, recorded, and weaponized. She denied, pleaded, begged. But the tower loomed, as it always did, for Tudor wives. And then came the moment that rewrote her memory forever. According to court legend, Catherine broke free from her chambers at Hampton Court upon hearing of her impending arrest. She ran down the gallery, screaming for Henry, who was praying in the chapel. She banged on the doors, crying out for mercy, for love, for attention, anything. Guards seized her before she could reach him. He never saw her, never spoke to her again. Now, this story may be apocryphal. It doesn't appear in the most contemporary records, but it appeared quickly afterward, retold in letters, poems, and whispers, and like all good stories, it stuck, because it felt true, because it captured the terrifying image of a young queen pleading for her life to a man who had already turned his back. Catherine was confined. Parliament passed a bill making it treason for a queen to conceal a sexual past from the king. Convenient timing. She was stripped of her title and, on the 13th of February, 1542, executed at the Tower of London. She was still a teenager, but she never left Hampton Court. Ask any guide, any night watchman, any tourist who got more than they paid for. They'll tell you about the haunted gallery, the long corridor where Catherine is said to have made her final dash. They'll describe cold spots, sudden sobbing, invisible footsteps. One recurring report tells of a white figure, sometimes running, sometimes kneeling at the chapel door, wailing. The accounts go back centuries. A soldier posted during the Napoleonic Wars reportedly deserted his post after seeing a woman in white vanish through a wall. In the 20th century, tourists fainted. In the 21st, thermal cameras picked up inexplicable heat signatures when no one was there. Is it Catherine? Maybe. Or maybe it's the echo of youth caught in a political meat grinder. A girl forced to be queen, judged by men twice her age, punished for things she couldn't undo. Maybe the gallery is haunted not by her ghost, but by her erasure. A stretch of hallway where history forgot mercy and remembered only scandal. But Hampton Court wasn't finished. Because 461 years later, another spectral figure equally cloaked, equally unexplained, would be caught slamming a door in that very same palace, not by rumour, not by legend, but by a CCTV camera, Hampton Court's 2003 Skeletor. In the age of smartphones and digital everything, most ghosts have the decency to stay blurry, pixelated, ambiguous. But in 2003, Hampton Court Palace, already drenched in centuries of blood, betrayal, and spectral lore, decided to join the modern world in the strangest way possible, with surveillance footage. The palace had recently upgraded its security system. New CCTV cameras were installed along key corridors, including the exhibition spaces where priceless Tudor-era artifacts were displayed. For a place like Hampton Court, England's grandest surviving Tudor palace, with a backlog of royal drama that reads like a Shakespearean fever dream, security was essential. And then, on 3 separate days in October, something strange happened. The heavy fire doors near the exhibition space, massive oak panels weighing enough to challenge the shoulders of a rugby team, flew open, not once, but multiple times, with no one nearby. The first 2 incidents were noted with raised eyebrows. Staff assumed it was wind, a draft, some odd quirk of the ancient building's respiratory system. But the 3rd day, the 23rd of October, gave them a gift no one had asked for: clear, colour, security footage. It showed the doors swinging open violently, and there, in the frame, stood a figure. A tall, robed figure, broad-shouldered, hooded, dressed in what appeared to be a long, dark gown or cloak. He or it emerged from the side, stepped into the doorway, grasped the edge of the door, and calmly slammed it shut. Pause there. This was not a flash of light, not a fuzzy silhouette. This was a fully visible humanoid figure, with facial features partially visible, dressed in antiquated garb, operating physical objects in a high-security area. When the staff reviewed the footage, they were so unsettled they assumed it was a prank. They interrogated the security team, asked about costumed guides, pulled staffing schedules, checked keycard logs. No one was unaccounted for. No reenactors were in that part of the building. No actors. No visitors. The doors were locked from the inside. No alarms had been triggered. And, crucially, the figure had never been seen by the naked eye. Just by the camera. The press got wind of it quickly. Within days, the figure had earned a nickname, Skeletor. A lazy tabloid-style reference to the villain from He-Man, prompted more by the vague skull-like shape of the figure's face than any real resemblance. Still, the name stuck, because of course it did. Paranormal investigators descended, skeptics rolled their eyes, but the footage was released publicly, and to this day, it remains one of the most viewed royal ghost videos on the internet. Unlike grainy Victorian photographs or ambiguous EVPs, this one felt almost too clear, too staged. And that's what made it all the more eerie. Let's address the obvious theories. Prank? Possibly. But who would have had the motive, access, and skill to execute such a hoax in a UNESCO-recognized heritage site without being caught or coming forward for credit? No one ever claimed responsibility. Costumed staff member? None reported missing or off schedule. None wore robes that matched the figure's clothing. And again, no one in that part of the building at the time. Camera glitch? It would be a strange glitch to fabricate a fully formed human figure with motion-matched actions, especially only once, and only in that frame. Edited footage? The palace released the original security files. Multiple experts analysed the video. No signs of tampering. It was caught simultaneously on separate feeds from different angles. So what was it? The answer, if we can call it that, likely depends on how you feel about ghosts in the first place. But Hampton Court is no stranger to the paranormal. It has long claimed to be among the most haunted buildings in England, with spirits including Catherine Howard screaming in the gallery, Jane Seymour walking near her deathbed, and even a spectral dog. Palace staff have reported cold spots, disappearing figures, and footsteps on empty floors for decades, maybe centuries. But Skeletor felt different. Because this was a ghost that showed up in a format we weren't ready for. Clear, recorded, digital. He didn't wail or float or flicker. He pulled open a door and shut it behind him. Businesslike. Brief, as if haunting was just part of the job. And then he vanished. He hasn't been seen since. Was it a projection of centuries of collective memory, a time loop, a glitch in something larger than security software, or just a moment caught in pixels where the past briefly walked through the present? No one knows. But the doors, they say, still swing sometimes. And not all the ghosts in royal history come in robes or rags. Some walk in military boots, some fall from the sky. And one, in 1942, fell harder than most off a Scottish mountain, in a royal plane crash that raised more questions than it ever answered. The Duke of Kent's wartime crash, 1942. He was the first royal to die on active military service in over 500 years, and the only one to do so in a flaming aircraft on the side of a Scottish mountain, under circumstances so confusing, so conveniently classified, and so persistently suspicious that the crash has never been convincingly explained, not to the public, and perhaps not even to the Crown itself. Prince George, Duke of Kent, handsome, charismatic, and youngest son of King George V, died on the 25th of August, 1942, when the military aircraft he was aboard, a short Sunderland flying boat, crashed into Eagles Rock near Dunbeath in Caithness, Scotland. The official version is short and unsatisfying. The plane was en route from Invergordon to Iceland on a morale-boosting mission, veered off course in poor weather, and struck the hillside in a tragic accident. 10 of the 14 men on board died, among them the Duke. But as with so many royal tragedies, it's not the facts that haunt, it's the absences, the edits, the silences that follow too closely on the heels of official statements. To begin with, the crash shouldn't have happened. The short Sunderland was a reliable aircraft. The flight path was well known and the crew experienced. The weather, while foggy, wasn't especially dangerous. More curiously, the plane was nearly 20 miles off course when it crashed, heading inland into the Highlands instead of out to sea. Why? Some have suggested pilot error, but the pilot, Flight Lieutenant Frank Goyen, was seasoned and familiar with the route. Others claimed a navigational failure. Yet, no mechanical fault was ever documented in detail, and the wreckage was heavily guarded almost immediately by both the RAF and other unnamed officials. Even decades later, when researchers requested full access to crash files under the Freedom of Information Act, key documents remained sealed. Then there's the matter of the passengers. The initial reports were inconsistent. Some mentioned 13 people on board, others said 14. The official casualty list changed multiple times. At one point, rumours swirled of a 15th unaccounted-for man, a mystery passenger, who may have survived and vanished into thin air. The RAF denied this, of course, but inconsistencies remained. More controversially, the Duke's body was reportedly found some distance from the wreckage, prompting theories that he might have attempted to parachute out or had been moved post-crash. One eyewitness, decades later, claimed to have seen the prince's body sitting upright in a separate location. That account was never verified, but it fed into the growing list of suspicions that this was no ordinary accident. And then there's the question of why the Duke was on that flight at all. At the time, Prince George held a ceremonial role in the RAF, but he was not a frontline commander, nor an essential figure in the war effort. His journey to Iceland was largely symbolic, a morale mission. So why was he flying in a Sunderland aircraft typically used for maritime patrols? And why was the route so unusual? Some theories veer into the dramatic. One claims the Duke was on a secret diplomatic mission to broker early peace negotiations with Nazi Germany, possibly through neutral Sweden. That's a stretch, but it reflects real fears in the early 1942 that factions within Britain's elite might have sought a negotiated end to the war. Prince George, who had ties to European royalty and sympathies with some pre-war appeasement circles, was a plausible courier, at least in the fevered minds of post-war conspiracy theorists. Another theory links the crash to the Duke's allegedly turbulent personal life. Before the war, he was known for scandal rumours of drug use, affairs, both heterosexual and not, and friendships with disreputable figures. Could someone have wanted him quieted? Again, there is no proof, but the royal family's posthumous portrayal of George has been notably sanitized. The discrepancies, some argue, were not in the crash, but in the curated silence that followed. Officially, it was an accident. And perhaps it was. Planes crash, weather shifts, tragedy happens. But the Duke's death sits in that peculiar twilight zone of royal mysteries, not quite scandal, not quite conspiracy, but never fully settled. He was buried with full honours. His widow, Princess Marina, never publicly questioned the crash. His children, including the future Duke of Kent, grew up in the long shadow of a father who had died serving the crown. The file was closed. But the crash site remains. Eagle's Rock still stands above the cliffs of Caithness, marked now by a memorial cairn. The air is cold, the wind loud, the silence total. Just like the file. And silence has always been the crown's most versatile armour, especially when a monarch's reputation is on the line. But the written word is harder to bury. And when a queen is accused not by rumour, but by her own letters that speak of love, betrayal, and a murdered husband, the silence starts to splinter. Mary, Queen of Scots, Casket letters. In the middle of a courtroom in 1568, a wooden casket, no bigger than a shoebox, was opened in front of a panel of English commissioners. Inside, a bundle of handwritten letters, love poems, and incriminating notes. They were allegedly written by Mary, Queen of Scots, to her third husband's murderer, letters that, if genuine, meant she had not only betrayed her husband, but actively conspired in his death. That was the story. But nothing about Mary's story was ever simple. She had once been England's most dangerous queen, not because of what she did, but because of who she was. Mary Stuart was a Catholic with a direct blood claim to the English throne. Born in 1542, she became Queen of Scots as an infant. At 15, she was Queen Consort of France. Widowed by 18, she returned to rule Scotland in a time of Protestant upheaval, political chaos, and bitter rivalries. In 1565, she married her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. It was a disaster. Darnley was handsome, arrogant, and unstable. He demanded power, publicly humiliated Mary, and grew increasingly violent. He was jealous of her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, whom he helped murder in front of the pregnant queen in her own chambers. By 1567, Darnley was despised by nearly everyone, including possibly Mary herself. Then, in February of that year, Darnley was found dead. His house, Kirkhope Field in Edinburgh, had been blown up in the night. His body, however, showed no signs of injuries consistent with an explosion. He was found in the garden strangled, according to some reports, though the official cause of death was never definitively recorded. The case should have triggered a national scandal. Instead, it turned into something worse, a national mystery. Suspicion quickly fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a brash noble with military backing, suspected of orchestrating the murder. And then, barely 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary married Bothwell. That was the match that broke the realm. Many of her subjects turned on her. Nobles rebelled. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, and eventually fled across the border into England, seeking protection from her cousin, Elizabeth I. Instead, she found a cage. Elizabeth didn't trust Mary. She saw her as a rival, a magnet for Catholic plots. But executing a fellow queen outright would be a dangerous precedent. So, a legal mechanism was needed, something to justify indefinite detention. Or worse, enter the Casket letters. During the inquiry into Darnley's murder, the Scottish lords opposing Mary claimed they had intercepted a silver casket belonging to Bothwell. Inside were 8 letters and several sonnets, supposedly written by Mary. They were steamy, emotional, and deeply compromising. One letter appeared to express a desire to be free of her husband. Another referred to intimate meetings with Bothwell. Together, they painted a damning portrait of a queen not just entangled in an affair, but plotting her husband's downfall. But were they real? The letters were never shown to Mary. She was not allowed to examine the originals. She denied writing them, called them forgeries, and claimed her enemies had fabricated the entire thing to destroy her politically and morally. And she may have been right. The originals no longer exist. Only translations, copies, and later summaries survive. Scholars have noted significant discrepancies in handwriting, style, and grammar. Some suggest the letters may have been pieced together from authentic writings, edited to change their tone or context. Others argue they were complete inventions. Yet Elizabeth's commissioners didn't formally declare them forgeries. They didn't authenticate them either. In true Tudor fashion, they reached no definitive conclusion. The inquiry was quietly shelved, and Mary remained a prisoner for nearly 19 years. Over time, the letters became legend. They were held up as proof of Mary's guilt, then later reinterpreted as examples of Tudor propaganda. Each generation of historians has found something different in them: romantic tragedy, political conspiracy, or outright forgery. But the effect was lasting. The Casket letters poisoned Mary's reputation and gave Elizabeth just enough political cover to keep her cousin locked away. They were never used in a trial. They were never authenticated. But they served their purpose. They silenced a queen not with chains, but with suggestion. Mary was eventually executed in 1587 after being implicated in a separate plot to assassinate Elizabeth. But the questions never stopped. Did she write the letters? Did she love Bothwell? Did she help kill Darnley? Or was she framed by lords who feared her power and used a box of papers to unmake a queen? It's the perfect royal mystery. Small enough to be tucked into a casket, big enough to destabilize a throne. But Mary wasn't the only queen to leave behind a medical enigma either. Because the monarch who eventually sent her to the block, Elizabeth I, would die almost 20 years later, with no diagnosis, no autopsy, and no one brave enough to ask why. What killed Elizabeth I? For a queen who defied every expectation, Elizabeth I left her reign with one final, perfectly unsatisfying mystery. No one knows how she died. She ruled for 44 years longer than any previous English monarch, and in doing so, became something more than a sovereign. She became a symbol, a legend, a golden myth wrapped in red wigs, white laid makeup, and Renaissance spectacle. Her death, therefore, was supposed to be a national moment of reckoning, a clear end to a towering life. Something precise. Instead, it was one long, uneasy silence. In the spring of 1603, Elizabeth I was 69 years old. By Tudor standards, that made her ancient. She had survived conspiracies, assassination plots, invasion threats, and more than one suitor who likely preferred her dead. Her strength had become the cornerstone of England's identity. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, Mother of the Nation. Whatever name they gave her, the assumption remained the same. Elizabeth would endure. But something had shifted. In early March, she fell into a strange melancholy. The court described her as listless. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, refused to lie down. Instead, she stood for hours, silent and motionless, her fingers working restlessly at her side. When her attendants begged her to rest, she reportedly replied, "Must is not a word to be used to princes." She didn't speak of pain, not directly, but those around her said she was haunted, grieving, possibly for the death of her cousin and confidant, Catherine Carey, or maybe for the world she knew was slipping out of her hands. Some said she feared death, others thought she welcomed it, but no one could figure out what was wrong. There were no signs of a stroke, no evidence of plague or flu, no visible injuries, just a sovereign queen slowly withdrawing from the world, refusing food, whispering only in fragments, until eventually on the 24th of March she stopped speaking entirely. Sometime before dawn, she died. And here's where the mystery sharpens. No autopsy was ever performed. The cause of death was never officially recorded. For a monarch of Elizabeth's magnitude, this is extraordinary. There was no post-mortem inquiry, no medical documentation, not even a definitive statement from the court physicians. Just a rush to prepare the body for burial and transfer the crown quietly, seamlessly to King James VI of Scotland, her cousin and named successor. Theories filled the vacuum almost immediately. Some claimed she died of pneumonia. She had been exposed to cold drafts while standing sleepless for days. Others suggested blood poisoning from years of using white lead-based cosmetics, common in the era but toxic over time. Her famously pale complexion may have been not style, but symptom. Another theory, Elizabeth had throat cancer. One observer noted swelling on the side of her neck during her final days, which would align with certain types of tumour, but this is speculative. There was no examination, no biopsy, no modern diagnostic tools, just guesswork. More romantically, some believed she simply died of a broken heart. It's tempting to view her last weeks as the unravelling of an identity carefully constructed over decades. Elizabeth had outlived her friends, her enemies, her siblings, and even the Tudor dynasty itself. She left no heir, no husband, no legacy she could point to in flesh and blood. And she had long equated her own body with the state. The Queen was the kingdom. So when her strength left her, perhaps she saw no separation between personal death and national transformation. She resisted sleep not because she feared dying, but because she feared what would happen to England once she did. There's also the matter of her privacy. Elizabeth was famously guarded about her body. She hated doctors, refused examinations, avoided procedures. Even in her final days, she refused to allow a thorough physical inspection. She had spent her life carefully crafting a royal image, one of immortality, divine authority, and female strength, and she wasn't about to let anyone poke holes in it, not even as it decayed. And so the last mystery of Elizabeth I isn't how she ruled, it's how she disappeared. Slowly, stubbornly, and without explanation. A queen who turned silence into power, right up to the moment when that silence became eternal. Her funeral was massive. A state ceremony of black horses, tolling bells, and weeping crowds. But even then, no one could say precisely what had taken her. She left behind no clear diagnosis, no children, no direct heir of her body, just the end of a dynasty and a nation entering uncharted waters. And if Elizabeth died with her secrets still sealed inside her, she wasn't the only monarch whose body concealed more questions than answers. Because years before her time, there was another king, one whose mind unravelled in public, whose courtiers feared his moods more than any foreign threat, and whose illness, to this day, defies medical certainty. The madness of George III. He was the king who lost America, yes, but far more mysteriously, he was the king who lost himself. George III reigned over Britain for nearly 6 decades, one of the longest reigns in the country's history. But among the coronations, wars, reforms, and colonies, one shadow loomed larger than all: his mental collapse. Or, more precisely, the long, slow unraveling of a mind that once held an empire and then couldn't even hold a conversation. It wasn't always this way. When George ascended the throne in 1760, he was young, devout, and by Hanoverian standards, shockingly normal. He married only once, loved his wife, and avoided the sort of flamboyant scandal that had characterized his forebears. He was nicknamed Farmer George for his interest in agriculture, and though the moniker was meant to mock him, it spoke to a quieter, more grounded monarch than many expected. But beneath that steadiness was something less predictable. The first major episode came in 1788. It began, as these things often do, with subtle changes: insomnia, restlessness, rapid speech. But within weeks, the king's behavior had spiraled. He would talk for hours without stopping, repeating himself, jumping from topic to topic. His handwriting deteriorated. His temper flared. He became convinced of odd delusions, including talking to people who weren't there and believing he could speak without opening his mouth. At one point, he reportedly talked for over 50 hours straight. His courtiers were horrified. Physicians were summoned. Parliament panicked. By the end of the year, George had become unmanageable, restrained at times, and completely removed from state affairs. A regency bill was drafted, preparing to hand control to his son, the flamboyant Prince of Wales. And then he recovered. Miraculously, by the spring of 1789, George returned to clarity. He resumed his duties, made public appearances, and even gave thanks at a national service at St. Paul's Cathedral. Britain exhaled. The regency was shelved. The king was back. But the pattern had been set. George would suffer several more episodes over the following decades, each worse than the last. The severity and frequency increased, particularly after the death of his beloved daughter, Princess Amelia, in 1810. That final loss seemed to break something permanent. By 1811, George was declared unfit to rule. Parliament enacted the Regency Act, and his son, later George IV, took over in all but name. For the next 9 years, the king lived in seclusion at Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and almost entirely removed from reality. He died in 1820, a monarch in title only, long since passed into myth while still alive. So, what was it? What tore through the king's mind again and again, leaving no answers, only rumours and tragic anecdotes? For over 2 centuries, the question has been debated, re-diagnosed, and dissected. The most popular historical explanation was porphyria, a rare genetic disorder affecting the nervous system, causing pain, confusion, hallucinations, and erratic behaviour. The theory was first suggested in the 1962, based on symptoms reported in letters and diary entries. Supporters pointed to the presence of purple-coloured urine, a known side effect of some porphyria types, and the cyclical nature of George's episodes. But in recent years, the porphyria diagnosis has come under heavy scrutiny. Modern psychiatrists and historians have increasingly leaned toward bipolar disorder, possibly with psychotic features. The speed of George's speech, the manic energy, the insomnia, The grandiose delusions all align closely with modern descriptions of a manic episode. His periods of lucidity, punctuated by breakdowns, match the oscillations seen in bipolar individuals today. Other theories abound: lead poisoning from medicines or cutlery, arsenic exposure, a side effect of stress, overwork, or grief. Some even argue that a combination of physical and psychological conditions created a feedback loop, each exacerbating the other until the king could no longer distinguish between reality and illusion. But no theory is definitive. No diagnosis confirmed. Even with access to medical letters, physicians' notes, and George's own ramblings, the truth remains maddeningly elusive. The only certainty is the impact. George's condition helped shape modern Britain. The Regency period, formally from 1811 to 1820, was a cultural explosion. Architecture, art, fashion, and politics all flourished under the more hedonistic hand of the Prince Regent. But the silent figure behind it, all the blind, mad king locked away at Windsor, remained a national ghost. The British monarchy, always adept at quiet revisionism, slowly reshaped George III's legacy. He became not a tragic figure, but a tragic symbol. The king who held the line against Napoleon. The loyal father, the steady husband, the human embodiment of endurance, not collapse. But history remembers the cracks, not just the portrait. In the end, George III left behind one of the most documented reigns in royal history and one of the most poorly understood minds. We know what he did, we just don't know why he unraveled. And perhaps that's the greater fear. Not madness in kings, but madness that looks like kingship. A crown perched calmly over chaos. And speaking of crowns, what if one was built on a lie? Because long before George's mind gave way, another monarch attempted to erase a rival's claim not by force, but by legal fiction. A single document, rushed through Parliament, that declared an entire marriage null, and a king's children illegitimate. Titulus Regius, and a marriage that wasn't 1483. It was the kind of legal document that didn't just change a crown, it tried to erase a family. In 1483, after the death of Edward IV, England stood at a familiar crossroads, a child king on the throne, and a kingdom waiting to see who would rule in his name. Edward V, just 12 years old, was the son of a charismatic monarch and a commoner queen, Elizabeth Woodville. The boy had been raised in royal luxury, but hadn't yet worn the crown. His father had died suddenly in April, and before Edward could be crowned, he was taken into custody by his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. That uncle would soon become Richard III, and to justify it, he needed paperwork. The document was called Titulus Regius, Latin for the title of the king. It was passed by Parliament in 1484, and its purpose was devastatingly simple. It declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had never been valid. Therefore, their children, including the newly deposed Edward V and his younger brother Richard, were illegitimate bastards. No claim to the throne. No royal bloodline. Nothing. On paper, the issue came down to what's known as a pre-contract. According to the bill, before marrying Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV had already been promised legally and bindingly to another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler. Under canon law, that pre-contract would have made the later marriage invalid, which meant the children of that union were, in the eyes of both church and state, born out of wedlock. The timing of this revelation was convenient. There had been no whispers of illegitimacy while Edward IV was alive, no protestations during his son's upbringing, no clerics demanding a review. But the moment Richard seized power, the story emerged fully formed, legally airtight, and ready for Parliament. Titulus Regius didn't just smooth Richard's path to the throne. It attempted to annihilate any rival claim, and it nearly worked. For the short remainder of Richard III's reign, the law stood. Edward V and his brother were declared nullities. Their disappearance from the Tower of London became, by implication, less alarming. They were no longer royal heirs, just unfortunate noble boys caught in political crossfire. But Richard didn't keep the throne for long. In 1485, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth by Henry Tudor, who took the crown as Henry VII. And Henry had a problem. He wanted to marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, and Elizabeth Woodville. She was beloved by the people. Their marriage would unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York, but according to Titulus Regius, she wasn't a legitimate princess. She was the daughter of an invalid union. So Henry did something very efficient. He had the document destroyed. Within months of taking the throne, Henry VII passed legislation repealing Titulus Regius. He ordered every copy burned, every reference expunged. Anyone caught preserving a copy would face punishment. It was, quite literally, an attempt to delete a legal memory from England's political hard drive. Only one copy survived. The chronicler Thomas Rouse had transcribed it in his historical writings, and thanks to him, the document's contents remain known today. But officially, Titulus Regius was purged from the record, and yet its damage lingered. The very act of needing to repeal it highlighted the fragility of Tudor legitimacy. Henry VII claimed to rule by right of conquest, but his dynastic claim was weak. He needed his wife's bloodline to reinforce his own, and Titulus Regius had cast that bloodline into shadow. More broadly, the document remains one of the most brazen legal maneuvers in English royal history. It didn't challenge a rival claim, it erased it. It took a reigning king's children and declared them null, rewriting family history to suit political ambition. And perhaps most chillingly, it worked. At least in the short term. Richard III wore the crown. The princes disappeared. The truth was obscured. But in time, the act became a symbol of how vulnerable royal legitimacy really is. It's not forged in blood alone, but in documents, oaths, ceremonies, and when necessary, legal sleight of hand. Kings don't just fight with swords, they fight with parchment. Centuries later, Richard III would become a figure of deep historical revision. A villain to some, a misunderstood reformer to others. But no amount of PR could scrub the fact that he used a parliamentary act to declare his own nephews illegitimate. And it didn't end the mystery. Because even if Richard's claim held in law, the hearts of the people still belonged to those vanished boys, and their fate, sealed by silence and scandal, would echo endlessly in stone corridors and royal records. In fact, one of them, Edward V, may have left behind a strange trace, not in a grave, not in a letter, but in someone else's will. A small, overlooked bequest that decades later raised a bigger question. What happened to the prince's chain? Edward V's chain in a stranger's will, new lead. In the story of the princes in the tower, those two vanished sons of Edward IV, almost every trail ends in shadow. The boys were seen entering the tower in 1483. They were never seen again. Their fate remains one of the coldest cases in royal history. And yet, sometimes, something odd surfaces, a tiny ember in the ashes that makes the mystery flare to life again. One such ember appeared not in a dungeon or a royal chamber, but in the pages of a will written by a man with no known royal blood, no palace connection, and no official business with the princes at all. The man's name was John Green. The century, the 16th. The object, a gold chain. In his will, John Green left instructions for the care of a piece of jewellery he described as having belonged to Edward V. Yes, that Edward V, the boy king, the vanished heir, the royal child who disappeared into legend before he ever wore the crown. Green's will was not grand. He was no nobleman. He belonged to the gentry, respectable but not powerful. Yet he claimed to possess a royal heirloom of unspeakable weight, not in its gold content, but in its implication. The bequest was subtle, the language nonchalant, a line buried among more practical concerns: debts, land, livestock. But there it was, plain as ink, a chain that had once belonged to Edward V. No explanation of how it came into his hands, no origin story. Just a statement, cool, certain, impossible to ignore. Historians nearly did. For centuries, the will was catalogued and forgotten, one of thousands in the legal archives of England. It wasn't until modern scholars began combing through Tudor-era records with new digital tools that the entry resurfaced, and when it did, it landed with a dull, delayed thud. Because if the chain really did belong to Edward V, it meant one of two things. Either John Green was lying, or Edward V lived longer than history admits. But let's unpack both sides. Could Green have fabricated the claim? Certainly. By the 16th century, the story of the lost princes had already become part of English folklore. Saying you owned a piece of them, especially an object like a chain, which carried royal symbolism, might lend a certain mystique to your estate. Maybe it was a misattribution passed down through generations. Maybe someone in Green's family bought the chain from a merchant who spun a tale. Or maybe the object merely resembled one thought to have been the prince's, and Green, for reasons unknown, attached a grander story to it in his final hours. That's the tidy version. But what if the other version is true? What if the chain really did belong to Edward V? And what if Green had inherited or been entrusted with it, quietly, discreetly, as one might hide a burning piece of evidence? Could Green have been connected to someone in the tower? A guard? A servant? A sympathizer? Could the chain have been removed from the boy not after his death, but during a secret escape? Here's where things twist further. Records from the late 15th century do name men of the Green family in royal service. One branch, based in Northamptonshire, had dealings with the court under both Richard III and Henry VII. They weren't powerful, but they were present. Close enough, perhaps, to witness or participate in something unofficial. And then there's the curious fact that no royal inventory from the period lists Edward V's personal effects. Unlike other monarchs, or would-be monarchs, no catalogued regalia, no documented jewels, no stored garments. Everything vanished with the boy, except, maybe, this. A single chain, lost in a provincial will. Of course, skeptics argue it proves nothing. That without the object itself, without the chain in question, it's all hearsay. The will exists, yes, but the chain? Gone. Its trail ends with the paper. Still, the strangeness lingers. Because people don't just casually claim to own something that belonged to a missing king. Not in legal documents. Not when reputations and inheritances are at stake. And certainly not when the case still burned hot in the national imagination. Did Edward V survive? Was he smuggled out of the tower under the noses of his enemies? Was the chain a keepsake from a life continued in secret? Or was it all a carefully constructed false memory, embedded in a family story that outgrew the truth? We'll likely never know. But the mystery of the chain isn't just about metal. It's about the fact that, decades after the supposed death of a king, someone was still writing him into history as if he had never quite been erased. And even in death, Edward V continues to resist finality. In fact, one of the many loose ends of his story is the very place we think he died, the Tower of London. But what if we're not even sure where in the tower it happened? Because the site of his death, like his body, may not be where it's supposed to be. Where exactly did Henry VI die? Some kings die on battlefields, swords drawn, banners torn. Others, like Henry VI, disappear behind walls forgotten by their own century, then endlessly debated by everyone who came after. Officially, Henry VI died on the night of May 21, 1471, in the Tower of London. Unofficially, he was absorbed into a mystery that is never quite settled. A ghost of a monarch whose final moments are still up for debate, not just in terms of cause, but location. That's right, we don't actually know where in the tower he died. The standard version, offered by most popular histories and long displayed at the tower itself, points to the Wakefield Tower, a circular fortress with thick stone walls and a commanding view over the Thames. There's even a plaque inside it, a simple stone marker that reads, with solemn finality, "Here died Henry VI, 21 May 1471. Visitors pass by it like they're crossing into sacred ground. But the truth is more complicated, because there is no reliable contemporary source confirming that Wakefield Tower was the place of death. The plaque itself was added centuries later, based more on tradition and speculation than primary evidence. So if not Wakefield Tower, then where? Let's rewind to the context of his death. Henry VI was never a commanding ruler. He was pious, gentle, and politically ineffective, traits that might work for a monk, but not a medieval monarch trying to survive the Wars of the Roses. By 1471, the Yorkist cause had triumphed. Henry had been deposed again, and Edward IV had taken back the throne. Henry's only son had just died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. His queen was imprisoned. His allies were either dead or in exile. He was alone. The official word was that Henry died of melancholy, that he simply faded in grief after hearing of his son's death. The court accepted this explanation with the kind of quiet discomfort reserved for things no one believes, but everyone agrees not to challenge. But everyone knew what really happened. Or at least, what they thought really happened. The strongest suspicion, both then and now, is that Henry was executed quietly, possibly on Edward IV's orders, to eliminate any further Lancastrian threat. His death occurred just after the Yorkist victory and Edward's recoronation. The timing is precise, too precise. It was the last loose end to tie, and that's where the location becomes important. If Henry was murdered, as so many believe, then the room matters. The layout, the isolation, the proximity to his jailers. Wakefield Tower is certainly dramatic. But other locations inside the tower complex were in use at the time as royal apartments, including the Lanthorn Tower and the Bloody Tower, then simply part of the inner ward. One alternative theory suggests he died or was killed in the chapel of Street John, which sits atop the White Tower. It would have offered isolation, yes, but also symbolism, a sacred space, a final dark mercy. Yet another theory, less poetic and more logistical, points to the Garden Tower buildings, long since destroyed, where records suggest Henry may have been housed at the time. These buildings, used for lodging high-status prisoners, were away from the main gate, more easily guarded, and less ceremonially significant. Adding to the confusion, the tower has been rebuilt and renovated so many times in the last 500 years that almost none of its medieval floor plan remains untouched. Entire buildings are gone, staircases moved, names changed. Wakefield Tower might have referred to something different altogether in the 15th century. And there's this. No autopsy was conducted. No records of burial preparation survive. No eyewitness account describes the room, the body, or the moment. Henry's remains were later transferred to Windsor Castle, buried quietly in St. George's Chapel. His tomb is there today, simple, somewhat ignored, easy to miss in the shadow of louder monarchs. But absence speaks volumes. The ambiguity of where he died mirrors the ambiguity of his life. Henry VI never fully occupied his own throne, his own power, or even his own historical identity. He was a king in name, but rarely in control. His death, like his reign, feels more like something that happened to him than something he did. And that may be why the Tower resists telling the full story. Because Henry didn't die with a sword in his hand, or a speech on his lips. He died somewhere, somehow, in a place designed to protect kings, but better known for destroying them. Maybe in Wakefield, maybe not. Maybe at prayer, maybe not. Maybe with a dagger, maybe with nothing at all. What remains is a question without a room. And speaking of identities hidden in plain sight, what if a king thought dead suddenly reappeared years later, disguised as a commoner, standing before his son? Because according to one very strange 14th century report that might have happened, was William le Galeys really Edward II, 1338? History likes its kings dead on time, neatly buried, properly mourned, respectfully chronicled, especially the difficult ones. But Edward II was not a tidy king, and his end officially recorded as a murder in Berkeley Castle in 1327 has never quite convinced everyone who reads past the footnotes. Too convenient, too rushed, too quiet. And then, years later, a man appeared on the continent, calling himself William the Welshman William le Galeys, claiming, subtly but unmistakably, that he was Edward, the deposed king, the one supposedly long dead. And the most startling part, he was granted an audience with Edward III, his son. Let's rewind. Edward II had never been a strong ruler. He lost key battles in Scotland, favoured unsavoury courtiers, and alienated his barons, most of whom viewed him as ineffective at best, disastrously stubborn at worst. By 1326, Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, had led a successful rebellion, forcing Edward to abdicate in favour of his teenage son. He was taken to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. The new regime didn't want a martyred king on their hands, so they held off on executing him for a while. But by September of 1327, a message went out. Edward II had died. The cause was vague. The event was secretive. No one outside a small circle ever saw the body. The funeral included a closed coffin. The location of the remains was, and remains, contested. And then came the letter. Sometime in the late 1332, a papal notary named Manuele Fieschi sent a letter to Edward III. It claimed that Edward II had not died in 1327, that instead he had escaped from Berkeley Castle with the help of a servant, that he had travelled in disguise to Ireland, then crossed into France, wandered through lands under false names, and was now living quietly in an Italian monastery as a hermit. The Fieschi letter, as it's now known, was detailed, perhaps too detailed. It described secret escape routes, names of accomplices, movements through known and unknown regions. If it was a lie, it was an unusually well-researched one. But what makes this more than just an odd curiosity is what happened in 1338. That year, while travelling through Europe, Edward III, then in the early stages of his wars with France, met a man who called himself William le Galeys. William the Welshman. An alias that may as well have come with a wink. This man, according to a contemporary account, claimed to be none other than the former king, his own father, and Edward III listened. He didn't dismiss the man, didn't throw him in chains. He received him, spoke with him. According to some versions, he even provided him with financial support afterward. A grant. A pension for someone claiming to be a royal impostor. That's more than polite. Now, did Edward III believe this man was his father? Historians are divided. It's possible he knew the man was deluded, but showed him mercy. Or maybe he suspected there was some truth in the story, something he couldn't publicly acknowledge, but couldn't quite deny. After all, Mortimer, the man most responsible for Edward II's downfall and alleged death, had been executed for treason in 1330. Isabella had been quietly sidelined. Maybe Edward III had begun to question the narrative he'd inherited. But there's another theory. That William le Galeys was indeed Edward II, that the body buried in 1327 belonged to someone else. That Mortimer and Isabella faked the death, either to avoid killing the king outright or to reduce political risk. That Edward II escaped into exile with a monk's robe and a new name, while his country tried to forget him. It's improbable, and yet not impossible. Edward II had supporters even after his fall. He had resources, and he had a history of slipping away from danger only to resurface inconveniently. The logistics are murky, but not implausible. The emotional stakes are stranger. If William le Galeys really was Edward II, then his meeting with his son 11 years after his supposed death would be one of the most extraordinary royal encounters never officially recorded. But the story doesn't end there. Because in the decades that followed, the legend of Edward II's survival became a kind of quiet undercurrent in English memory. Chroniclers revisited the story. The Fieschi letter was preserved. The meeting in Koblenz between Edward III and a man who should have been dead was mentioned but never explained. No proof, no grave, no conclusion. Just the idea of a fallen king who refused to stay buried. A man whose failure as a monarch was legendary, but whose escape, if true, was his one masterstroke. Disappear, reappear, confuse history forever. But even that might not be the strangest part of the story. Because decades later, long after the Tower of London had supposedly answered the riddle of the missing princes with the discovery of bones, another question arose. Why didn't those bones solve anything? Why didn't the 1,674 Tower bones end the prince's case? It should have been the final chapter. In 1674, nearly 2 centuries after Edward V and his younger brother disappeared from the Tower of London, workmen demolishing a staircase in the White Tower made a discovery. Roughly 10 feet below the stone floor, in a chest buried under rubble and lime, they found bones. Small bones. Human bones. The skeletons of 2 children. They were discovered precisely where no one wanted to find them and exactly where everyone suspected they might be. It was immediately assumed they were the remains of the lost princes Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York. The same 2 boys who had vanished in 1483 under the protection or control of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who became Richard III. The theory was that the boys had been murdered in secret and buried in haste, their bodies hidden beneath a now demolished staircase within the tower grounds. Problem solved, right? But history rarely gives us such neat conclusions, and the 1,674 bones, rather than closing the case, only made it murkier. Let's begin with the discovery itself. The bones were not subjected to any serious analysis. There was no forensic science in the 17th century, not in any meaningful form. The skeletons were identified as the princes largely on assumption and convenience. They fit the narrative. 2 boys, hidden in the tower, found beneath stone and lime, which was sometimes used for preservation or alternatively to speed decomposition. Close enough. King Charles II ordered the remains to be placed in Westminster Abbey, where they were interred with royal honours in an urn bearing their supposed identities. The tomb was inscribed, the story filed away. And yet, even at the time, there were questions. Some accounts claim that the skeletons were incomplete. Others noted that the surrounding area contained animal bones and building debris, suggesting the chest may have been a catch-all burial or even a dumping site. There was no record of clothing, shrouds, or any personal items found with the bodies. No context, just two small skeletons and centuries of speculation. Fast forward to the 20th century. In 1933, during a period of renewed historical interest and under increasing public pressure, the Abbey allowed the bones to be examined. Not removed, not tested, but studied in place. A team of anatomists and dental experts was brought in to determine the age and condition of the remains. Their findings were ambiguous. The larger of the two skeletons was estimated to be about 12-13 years old, aligning with Edward V's age at the time of his disappearance. The smaller was thought to be roughly 9-11, but Richard, Duke of York, was around 10, so that almost fit. However, the condition of the bones suggested they had been jumbled, possibly mixed with animal remains. The experts couldn't agree on the sex of the skeletons, and the examination was limited by the technology of the time. No DNA testing, no radiocarbon dating, no definitive conclusion. In short, compelling, but not conclusive. Calls for further investigation have persisted ever since. In the early 2000s, prominent historians and even members of the royal family suggested that modern forensic techniques could finally provide answers. DNA from the bones could be compared to known Plantagenet descendants. Carbon dating could establish time of death. But the Church of England, which oversees Westminster Abbey, declined. Their official reasoning? Ethical concerns. The remains were buried with royal honours, and disturbing them again would violate the sanctity of the tomb. The subtext? Opening the urn might not bring clarity, it might open a new wave of national discomfort. Because if the bones aren't the prince's, then where are they? And if they are, who killed them? That's the real problem. The Tower bones don't offer closure. They offer implication. If we accept they are the prince's, we're still left with the question of who buried them, who ordered the murder, who got close enough to carry it out. Richard III? Henry VII? A rogue agent? A family member? Every answer leads to another accusation. And so the mystery lingers. Official history makes a quiet nod to the 1674 discovery. Tour guides point to it. The urn is photographed. But even the Tower of London, with all its plaques and dramatised tours, presents the case as unresolved. They may have been found, the story goes, but we still don't know the whole truth. And that's the most honest answer anyone can give. Two boys went into the tower. Two skeletons came out of the rubble. Centuries lie between those two moments, and nothing ties them together beyond proximity and assumption. It's not proof, it's a suggestion in stone. And while the bones remain sealed behind their urn, another royal artifact was believed to have been sealed forever in history. The Tudor Crown, melted down, lost to time, gone. Or was it? Because centuries after Cromwell supposedly destroyed the royal regalia, a detectorist heard a beep. The Tudor Crown, gone or not? There are royal symbols you can fake, crests, portraits, Latin mottos etched in gold, but a crown? A crown is the real thing. It's heavy, sacred, public. It turns a man into a monarch, and a dynasty into something more than just a family with swords. So when Oliver Cromwell melted down the medieval crown jewels in 1649 after the execution of Charles I, it wasn't just an act of practical republicanism, it was an obliteration of memory. No more divine right, no more anointed kings, no more literal crown. The Tudor crown, in particular, was believed to have been destroyed completely. This was the crown used in the coronations of every English monarch, from Henry VII to Charles I. We know what it looked like because of paintings, coins, and records. 5 arches, rich enamel, precious gems, gold fleur-de-lis, a cap of crimson velvet. Regal, yes, but also distinct. It was the symbol of royal continuity. And in a wave of anti-monarchy fervour, Parliament decided it had to go. In the 1649 inventory drawn up by the Republican regime, the Tudor crown was valued for its raw materials: gold, pearls, sapphires. The stones were removed and sold. The gold was sent to the mint and turned into coins. The cap was burned. The very idea of monarchy was supposed to be burned with it. And for centuries, that was the accepted story. The crown was lost. Gone. Nothing remained but reproductions and one surviving painting. Charles I, wearing the Tudor crown with a haunted look in his eyes, painted before the blade fell. But then something beeped in a field in Northamptonshire. In 2017, a metal detectorist named Kevin Duckett was scanning a patch of land near Market Harborough. What he found was small, delicate, and covered in soil. At first glance, it looked like part of a brooch. But after cleaning it and showing it to experts, the object turned out to be something extraordinary. A golden figurine of a king, seated and holding an orb and scepter, enamelled in blue and red. It was one of the figures from the lost Tudor crown, and suddenly the narrative of complete destruction was complicated. Experts at the British Museum and other institutions examined the figurine. It matched descriptions and illustrations from historical records. The styling was consistent with 16th century regalia, right down to the facial details. The figure likely sat on one of the crown's fleur-de-lis ornaments, part of the original decoration that had once symbolized England's authority over France. But how did it survive? There are theories. Maybe the crown was disassembled more sloppily than Cromwell's records admit. Maybe one of the craftsmen pocketed a piece. Or perhaps, during the chaos of the Civil War, someone smuggled out a fragment as a keepsake or an act of defiance. The figurine may have been lost while being transported or hidden, buried either deliberately or by accident. And the location adds intrigue. Market Harborough isn't just random farmland, it lies near the site of the Battle of Naseby, the decisive clash in 1645 between royalists and parliamentarians. It's possible that royal baggage or regalia pieces were moved through this area and hastily concealed. More provocatively, what if more of the crown survived? If one ornament turned up after nearly 400 years, why not others? Could more pieces be buried under layers of dirt and forgetfulness? Could the crown be fragmentary, not gone? Of course, none of this changes the official line. The Tudor crown, as an object, is still considered lost. The British crown jewels currently housed in the Tower of London were created for Charles II after the Restoration. They're gorgeous, but they're replacements, restorations of a tradition, not continuations of the old line. But the 2017 discovery changes something more subtle. It pokes a hole in the story. It reminds us that history's certainties are often built on what hasn't been found yet. The crown was supposed to be obliterated, not because it was gold, but because it meant something. Its destruction was meant to be permanent. But memory isn't always obedient. Sometimes it rusts. Sometimes it shatters. But occasionally, it's dug up again holding a scepter. That figurine is now in museum custody, waiting for formal identification and exhibition. It hasn't been officially declared part of the Tudor Crown, but few serious historians doubt the connection. A missing king's image, found centuries after his kingdom burned, which raises the question, what else is buried? Because the next royal mystery doesn't involve gold or regalia, it begins on a staircase, a very real one. A woman lay dead at the bottom of it in 1560, no crown, no glory. Just a shattered body and a future queen's reputation hanging in the balance. Her name was Amy Robsart. Amy Robsart's fall, 1560. She was found at the bottom of the stairs, neck broken, body twisted, dignity shattered. On the 8th of September, 1560, Amy Robsart, wife of Robert Dudley, the favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, was discovered dead at Cumnor Place in Oxfordshire. No witnesses, no explanation. Just a brief inquest, a suspicious verdict, and a political scandal that never quite unspooled all its knots. Even now, more than 460 years later, the case refuses to settle into a single version of the truth. Amy was 28 years old, married young to Robert Dudley, himself a golden boy of Tudor society. The marriage had been one of noble alliance rather than romance. They were both of high birth, but not quite royal. When Dudley rose in Queen Elizabeth's favour, becoming her master of the horse, close confidant, and suspected paramour, Amy was increasingly left behind, both geographically and emotionally. She lived mostly apart from her husband during his meteoric rise at court, and then, without warning, she died. Her servants found her at the foot of a staircase. Her neck was broken. There were no other wounds, no sign of struggle, and, crucially, no witnesses. At the time, Dudley was with Elizabeth at Windsor Castle, far from Cumnor. But proximity wasn't the issue. The problem was motive. Because with Amy out of the picture, Dudley, who many believed Elizabeth wished to marry, was suddenly free. And everyone noticed. The inquest returned a verdict of misfortune, an oddly clinical term for a tragic death. Not accident, not natural causes, not foul play. Just misfortune. A Tudor shrug. The official coroner's report, preserved in the National Archives, was oddly vague. It noted the broken neck, the location of the body, and little else. The inquest had been held in secret, without public scrutiny, and the records were hidden from view for centuries. That fact alone cast suspicion over the findings. Whispers spread immediately. Many believed Amy had been murdered either directly, by order of someone eager to remove an obstacle to Elizabeth and Dudley's union, or indirectly, by pressures that drove her to a despairing fall. But then again, maybe it was an accident. Cumnor Place was not a well-maintained manor. The stairs were reportedly steep, uneven, and poorly lit. Amy may have fallen simply and tragically. Some reports suggested she was ill at the time of her death. There were rumours she suffered from breast cancer, which could have made her bones brittle and more prone to breakage. Others claim she had a swollen sore or an ulcer, which might explain her isolation and discomfort. Still, many historians find the accident explanation too tidy. If Dudley had no hand in the death, someone else might have. The political climate was cutthroat. Dudley had enemies who feared the prospect of him marrying the Queen. Removing Amy could ruin him publicly, exactly what his enemies would want. A carefully staged death, made to look like murder, could have been designed to implicate Dudley without implicating them. And it worked. Whether he was innocent or not, Dudley's chances of marrying Elizabeth effectively died with his wife. The Queen was devastated. Not necessarily by Amy's death, but by the optics. The court gossiped with venomous delight. European ambassadors reported rumours of scandal to their monarchs. Elizabeth's advisors warned her that marrying Dudley now would destroy her credibility and threaten the stability of her reign. She never did marry him. Dudley remained at court. He held power, titles, and a place near the throne, but the marriage never happened. Something in the Queen shifted after Amy's death, a political instinct, perhaps, or a personal hesitation. Love is powerful, yes, but public perception in a Tudor court was lethal. Amy, meanwhile, was buried in St. Mary's, Oxford. Her tomb is plain. Few visitors linger there. In death, she became an accessory to other people's ambition, a royal inconvenience, a question mark at the foot of a staircase. In modern times, forensic pathologists have reviewed the case. Some believe the injuries described in the coroner's report are consistent with a fall, perhaps exacerbated by bone disease. Others suggest that the absence of defensive wounds or other trauma supports the accident theory. But again, there are no witnesses, no photographs, no surviving evidence. Just a dead woman, a royal scandal, and a verdict that feels too neat. In the end, Amy Robsart became a footnote to other people's stories, a plot device in the drama of Elizabeth and Dudley. But the mystery of her death still hums in the background of Tudor history, quietly, persistently, waiting to trip up anyone who thinks they've figured it out. And if Cumnor Place had a reputation after her fall, it was nothing compared to another address. A towering fortress with more than one royal secret to its name. Because the Tower of London doesn't just hold bodies, it holds reputations hostage. And its death-stained reputation has long outlived the kings and queens it swallowed whole. The Tower's death-stained reputation. The Tower of London does not whisper, it groans. Under the weight of centuries, under the footsteps of monarchs, traitors, martyrs, and ghosts. It is one of the most iconic fortresses in the world, and yet no one ever seems to talk about it fondly. Because behind its postcard angles and ceremonial guards lies something darker, something soaked into the stones themselves. It is not just the place where kings kept their crowns. It's the place where they lost their heirs, their friends, their wives, and sometimes their minds. The Tower's reputation isn't a single mystery, it's a reputation built out of them. Let's start with the architecture. Massive stone curtain walls, arrow slits, iron gates, moats, execution scaffolds. The place was designed to project permanence and power, but over time it became more prison than palace. It held queens, bishops, princes, ministers, spies. Some walked out, most didn't. Its official role, since its 11th century construction by William the Conqueror, was as a royal fortress and residence. But even in the earliest accounts, there's unease. It was a place where kings consolidated control by locking away those who challenged them. Those who disappeared behind its gates tended to be seen again only on paper. A death certificate, a confession, a stripped title. In some centuries, it was quiet. In others, it was practically overbooked. Under the Tudors, especially, the Tower became synonymous with paranoia. Henry VIII sent more than one queen through its gates, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard among them. Both entered as queens. Both exited via the scaffold. Not even royalty was safe from the blade when the Tower was involved. And the irony? The Tower wasn't even built for executions. In fact, most public executions took place outside on nearby Tower Hill so the crowd could watch. But a select few deaths occurred within its walls, by royal order, in the shadowed interior. These were the deaths that truly shaped its legend. High profile, high treason, high drama. Anne Boleyn's ghost, reportedly wandering near the chapel. the whispered prayers of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, beheaded at just 16. Even Guy Fawkes is said to have been interrogated in its chambers, though how much of that story is performance and how much is pain is a mystery in itself. Then there are the unexplained sounds. For generations, yeoman warders, also known as beefeaters, have told stories of unexplainable phenomena. Doors slamming, voices in empty rooms, cold spots in warm air, apparitions walking halls that should be silent. These are not fringe reports, they are part of the tower's lore, passed down like grim souvenirs. One of the eeriest details? The tower rarely resists retelling its own mysteries. Even its official learning resources, the pamphlets, the plaques, the guided tours, lean into ambiguity, especially in the case of the princes in the tower. One would think a government-run historic site would pick a side, confirm a theory, offer closure. But no, the tower's own website lists their fate as unknown. Its education material for schools still frames the case as unsolved, as if the place itself wants the ghosts to stay alive. That ambiguity is part of the magic and the horror. The tower doesn't need to solve anything. It just needs to stand there, brooding, collecting stories, offering no comment. The walls won't answer you, the cells won't explain themselves. The ravens might whisper, but only if you're not listening. Even the modern crown jewels, now kept securely within the tower, seem like glittering distractions from the blood in the bricks. They sparkle in a space that once saw silence, steel, and sorrow. The contrast is almost sarcastic. But perhaps the darkest aspect of the tower's reputation is how it sanitizes its secrets over time. Murder becomes mystery. Imprisonment becomes intrigue. Political executions become historic moments. It's a museum now, a tourist destination, a selfie backdrop. The blood has been mopped up but never erased. Its reputation, still intact, still stained. Still whispering something too quiet to quote, but too loud to forget. And so, the tower remains not just a place, but a character. One that swallows people and spits out stories. Some of those stories are embellished. Some are entirely fabricated. But others are too detailed, too strange, and too well preserved to dismiss. Like the official story of the princes, the one taught to children in schools across England, the one that ends not with an answer, but with a question mark. Because even now, centuries later, the state itself won't claim to know what happened. And neither will the tower. The prince's story retold for schools, and still no answer. Every school child in England hears the tale. 2 young princes, a crown that wasn't quite theirs, a tower that promised safety and delivered silence. It's taught carefully, almost cautiously, the kind of story you present with wide eyes and soft endings. The kind of story that makes history feel like a bedtime tale, just strange enough to remember, but not quite disturbing enough to question. And yet, even in the official educational materials distributed by the very institutions that preserve British history, one fact remains startlingly intact. No one says what really happened to them. No one can. Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, were the sons of King Edward IV. When their father died in 1483, one 2-year-old Edward was next in line for the throne. His coronation never happened. Within weeks, his uncle, the calculating, ambitious Richard, Duke of Gloucester, took control of the government, declared the boys illegitimate, and assumed the throne for himself as Richard III. The princes were housed in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection. And then nothing. They disappeared from public view by the end of the summer. There were no official announcements, no burials, no funerals, no bodies. The tower swallowed them whole. You'd think, given the centuries of royal record-keeping, the multiple monarchs who followed, and the mountain of Tudor propaganda that eventually crushed Richard III's legacy, the matter would have been clarified. A confession, a recovered body, a set of papers detailing a secret order. But no, we're left with fragments, rumours, conflicting accounts, and, more curiously, a continuing refusal to fill in the blanks. Visit the Tower of London today. Walk the very halls where the boys were held. Read the plaques. Watch the dramatised history displays aimed at school tours and tourists. What you'll find isn't a confident explanation, it's a question dressed up in historical uncertainty. Even the official Princes in the Tower video, developed for schools by historic royal palaces, ends without a resolution. It presents competing theories, lays out motives, describes the possible suspects, Richard III, Henry VII, the Duke of Buckingham, and then stops short. No villain crowned, no cause of death confirmed. The princes simply vanish, as they did in life, replaced by carefully worded ambiguity. Why? Part of the reason is academic honesty. The truth is, we don't know what happened. No definitive evidence has ever emerged. The bones discovered in 1674 may or may not be theirs. No document has surfaced ordering their death. No eyewitness left a reliable account. Richard III died at Bosworth Field in 1485 without publicly addressing the princes, and Henry VII, who would have gained from their deaths just as surely, had no interest in investigating further. Too many questions, too many skeletons, figurative and possibly literal. But there is also something else going on, a hesitation that feels institutional. Because if the princes were murdered, and if it was done for political gain, then it punctures the mythology of monarchy itself. It casts doubt on the idea that royal succession is noble, rightful, or even remotely clean. It turns the narrative of divine right into something more closely resembling a true crime documentary. And that's awkward, especially for institutions charged with preserving royal tradition and educating the public. So instead, the story is told in circles, offered as a mystery, embraced for its lack of resolution. It becomes a lesson not in politics or morality, but in ambiguity. And there's value in that. Teaching children that history is full of gaps, that not every story has a clear ending, that power is often built on silence, that's a lesson far more powerful than a neat timeline or a tidy villain. It's uncomfortable. And it should be, because somewhere, in some long-lost room of the tower, two brothers either died, escaped, or were quietly erased. And the state, centuries later, still chooses to teach their story not as history, but as a question. The final line of the official educational video? We may never know what really happened. That's not failure, that's a feature. The story remains suspended, not just in books or on plaques, but in the very architecture of royal myth. It reminds us that not every crown is earned, not every heir survives, and not every nation tells its full truth. And it's not the only story like that. Because while the case of the princes ends with a disappearance, the next royal mystery begins with bones and ends with doubt. And these bones weren't hidden, they were buried with honours. But what if they're not who we think they are? We are going back to the tower, to a chest under a staircase, to bones reburied, with questions still screaming from the silence.